The Paranoia is Gone Rebirth author, Qiaohe copywriting. In his previous life, Yunqing had departed from his love for the emperor and wanted to live and die. In life, he made soup and clothes for him, and politically monitored his officials, even his mother's family. He focused on the emperor, and all his scheming strategies were used for solid pets. He never borrowed the power of the queen to seek employment for his relatives, and he did not show favoritism. It can be said to be selfless and selfless. Outsiders are terrified, and relatives hate. Yun Qingkai doesn't care. In the end, he was thrown into the cold palace by the only person he cared about and sent to prison full of doors. In the snowy day, he succumbed to the guilt downstairs. After relived his life, Yun Qingkai put away his claws, picked up the broken glass heart, sleekly lived in the world, and escorted his relatives. He decided to be a one that does not need pets, is equally arrogant, and no one can shake his position. After the rite, unexpectedly, the emperor who had abandoned him like a Shou, praised by countless courtiers for both virtue and kindness, suddenly changed his temper, became cold and harsh, paranoid and cruel. The servant confronted Yun Qingkai, and he beat. The imperial concubine provoked Yun Qingkai, and he punished him. The villain framed Yun Qingkai and killed him. When someone approached Yun Qingkai, he became jealous. Soon, everyone knew that the Queen of Cloud was the imperial scale of the emperor, and he was not allowed to look, touch, or hurt. Yun Qingkai ferryman is speechless. So you just like me but I don't love you, so say it earlier. Attack. I feel bitter but I don't say JPG I want to open it, accept X, I can't think about it, attack dog-blooded double life. Attacking the institutions of the previous life is considered painful to lose love and being abused thousands of times in this life and still chasing after pets. Chasing his wife and cremation no change, no change, no change, no matter the previous life and the present, there are only one another. Not changing the offense means that the offense will not be killed, and the psychological expectations of extreme abuse will not be met. Please be sure to confirm this before entering the pit. Content tag: The Marquis of the Palace reunites with the Broken Mirror and Rebirth Search keywords. Protagonist: Yun Qingkai, Li Ying supporting role, Advance Collection, The Daily Life of a Salted Fish in a Funeral. Others: Finished Crematorium, a canary that has been raised for 8 years. Brief introduction: The Emperor chases his wife at the crematorium. Purpose: you can't have both fish and bear's paws. Adults should understand what they want. The Guild Kifeng Tower is located in the northeast corner of the Forbidden City. It can be seen thousands of miles away from the sky. At night, you can have a panoramic view of the prosperous lights of the 4 cities of Shangyang. Everyone in Shangyang knows that this is the residence built by the emperor for Yunho's mother. Even though the Yun family has been sentenced to copying and slashing, Yun Qingkai has also been beaten into the cold palace, but the most promising concubine Ning Gui can still only watch from underneath with gritted teeth. The cold night was as cold as a blade, and the guards of the Forbidden City carried the windproof lanterns and patrolled in the snow. Suddenly someone exclaimed, "Someone upstairs!" At the corner of the building, a man in white clothes was hunting, standing against the wind. Presumptuous! The sound of armor collision sounded, and the leader of the guard brought people forward. Who is so bold, dare to climb the building behind the king? In the ice and snow, this man wore a sapphire hairpin on his head, a pair of unsuitable shoes, and a thin shirt that did not protect against the cold. He whizzed down from top to bottom, and slammed heavily on the slabs of the Forbidden City covered with thin snow. Superior! Red plum-like blood spots splashed around. This is... The unfinished words are all stuck in the throat. No one dared to touch anyone on the ground. Not just because he is the master of this building, the queen of the emperor. It is even more because his previous images of domineering and dehumanizing are too deeply rooted in the hearts of the people, so that he would end himself in this way, and everyone felt incredible, even creepy. Some people think that Yun Qingkai was broken by the emperor, so he chose to jump out of the Guild Kifeng Tower. After all, although he made outsiders terrified and hated by his relatives, he was heartbroken to the emperor, too good to say. More people think that Yun Qingkai is paranoid and arrogant, and when he is alive, he will often self-mutilate in order to gain the attention of the emperor. This time, self-destructiveness is just defending his place in the eyes of the emperor in an extreme way. The emperor wanted to destroy his whole clan, he didn't care, he was broken into the cold palace, his heart was broken like madness, really dare to love, hate and dare to give up, a life of madness. He seems to have never been so quiet before, hysterical, arrogant and jealous, acting like wind, and there is always a lingering hostility between his eyebrows. No one dares to look directly at his sharp, stern, arrogant and ridiculous eyebrows, so much so that they are ignored. He was actually born very well. Her lips are black, her skin is as white as ice, and her face looks like an alluring ink and wash. The thick blood spread from under him, quickly swallowing the snow, staining his coat and skin red, like a large piece of cinnabar splashed on a scroll of ink painting. When he closed his eyes and looked serene, the heaven and the earth seemed to fade with the blood-lost lips. The guard leader's throat was trembling, and he didn't dare to look more. Soon, the palace no longer allowed to talk about the Queen of Clouds, and the emperor, who had always been kind and virtuous, slayed all the palace slaves with broken mouths. This is the 15th year of Xianjing and the 12th year that Yun Qingkai married the emperor. The gilded Qifeng Tower, which has made countless concubines envy and jealous, still stands glamorously here, but is completely blocked from everyone's unattainable sight and becomes a forbidden place. And everything about Yun Qingkai, even his name, became a taboo in the palace, and no one dared to discuss it. The heavy snow pounded on the window lattice. Sitting by the charcoal fire in the house, Yingxi and Jin Huan were both quietly observing the people listening to the snow on the couch by the window. The other party's black hair was scattered, with a lazy expression, white gauze wrapped around his forehead and wrist, and his thin white slender fingers tapped on the handrail rhythmically, looking relaxed and comfortable. It's Queen Yun, and it doesn't seem to be Queen Yun. It was him because no one could reproduce his appearance, not because he shouldn't be so peaceful at the moment. Yesterday early in the morning, the Queen was not fully awake, she was thrown off the bed by her suddenly angry majesty, her forehead was knocked, and a lot of blood was shed. His Majesty then ordered someone to drive him back to his mother's house in a rage. The Queen rushed to beg like crazy, but to no avail, so she cut her wrist in an vain attempt to exchange her for sympathy. Although the doctor came in time, he still lost blood. Too much and fainted. And your Majesty, not only did he not give him a look, he was sent back to Xiangfu when he was in a coma, and he was not equipped with the necessary equipment for returning to the door, and there was no notice in advance, which led to the absence of Xiangfu. People greeted and waited for a long time. Although the imperial decree has not yet come down, what your Majesty has done is no different from after it was abolished. Everyone knew that he would go crazy when he woke up. Sure enough, the Queen opened his eyes while waiting in the air. The first thing was to go back to the Forbidden City to find Her Majesty. He ran to the Forbidden City on foot like crazy, the blood from his wrist was dripping down his fingertips, and he didn't care, no one could. Can persuade him. Fortunately, I didn't walk a few steps before I met Yun Xiangxia and headed back to the mansion, feeling that he was embarrassed and knocked him back unconscious. Everyone in the Yun family knew very well that Jun Yun would definitely have trouble after he woke up again, so he ordered people to guard the windows and doors of the house in advance to prevent him from sneaking out again. But today, he got up early in the morning. Not only did he not make a fuss, he obediently let Yingxi be drugged, and he took the breakfast seriously, and then stayed in the house honestly without going anywhere. Going up is very precious to your own body. Yingxi and Jin Huan were a little confused, they didn't know if he was making another idea, or if he really wanted to. Forbidden City, Zhongshan Temple. The Emperor's supervisor Lu Xiru looked at the slowly burning imperial decree in the brazier, and had almost the same doubts as the Queen's attendant. This is the post-abolition imperial edict. This time, the emperor was really annoyed by Yunqing's resignation. Not only did he pull the person off the bed and through his forehead when the other party was not awake, he also drafted an abandoned imperial decree immediately after returning to the Zhongshan temple. Yun Jiaquan was in the crowd, although Yun Qingkai was not in harmony with his family, but his honor and disgrace were related to the Yun family's face. The Queen Mother was worried that the emperor's impulsiveness would anger the Yun family, and she tried her best to dissuade her from issuing it immediately. Before going to bed yesterday, perhaps he finally figured it out, and he drafted another and quit book. This more gentle way than after the abolition was probably the final compromise he was going to make to Yun Qingkai. However, early this morning, when Lu Xiru packed up and came to serve him, he saw the always gentle and generous young emperor with disheveled hair, his eyes sharp as an eagle, hiding his madness and ruthlessness. "Where is the Susan I put under my pillow?" At that time, Lu Xiru wondered if he was too old and his brain was not working well, why he didn't have any impression of the emperor's pillow. He saluted tentatively, "Dare to ask your majesty, what kind of Susan is it?" Li Ying's eyes were filled with dense blackness, and he got up. A strong sense of oppression came from the tall figure, and it was like a ghostly spirit. People around him had never seen him look such a terrifying appearance. Immediately someone had their legs limp, and Lu Xiru couldn't help but knelt down, sweat slipping from his forehead. His neckline was grabbed by the emperor. Facing that handsome but gloomy face, Lu Xiru only felt that he was going to die. He held his breath, trying to control the trembling muscle tissue of his face. He used to think that although Li Ying had a stubborn heart, the emperor's disposition and behavior were all measured. At least in front of others, he was still a decent king. The only thing he was not decent was probably dealing with Yun Qingkai. But at this moment, Li Ying seemed to be a demon with his human skin torn off, becoming unscrupulous. He seemed to care nothing, he didn't put anything in his eyes. "Your Majesty." Lu Xiru clearly felt that Li Ying wanted to kill him. It was the little who was in charge of the report to rescue him. "Your Majesty, just now the guards came to report, and the Queen Mother sent someone to visit the Queen." Li Ying didn't like the Empress Dowager's intervention in him and Yunqing's resignation, so it was particularly noticeable. I don't know if it was Lu Xiru's illusion, the Emperor seemed to be in a daze. "Visit." Lu Xiru hurriedly said, "Presumably the Queen Mother learned of the Queen's trouble in the Xiang's mansion yesterday, so she sent someone to comfort the Yun family. I heard that the Queen Mother returned to the mansion and suffered another injury." Li Ying's chin suddenly tightened heavily, his eyelashes trembled, mist was covered in his eyes for a moment, and his throat became hoarse for a moment. "The Queen, my Queen. Still alive?" He didn't go on, so Lu Xiru didn't know. He was fortunate that he had recovered his life. When he saw the Emperor strode to the bookcase, he reached out to draw a memorial, his eyes focused on the date, Xianjing, 7 years. Yun Qingkai is still alive, and loves him madly. He chuckled, tears raining down. Frightened the group of people around him. Then, as it is now, he ordered someone to roll up his long hair and throw the planned abolished imperial decree into the brazier. Another thing was thrown in, and Li Shou. The man put on human skin again, and said gently, "Be prepared, simpler, I'm going to Xiangfu." Then he looked at Lu Xiru, "I had a nightmare just now, and I was a little gaff, which scared the husband." Lu Xiru immediately said, "Your Majesty, don't worry, the minister hasn't seen anything." Li Ying bends his lips kindly, rubbing his fingers on the corners of his clothes, and become more graceful. It seems that he is still the young emperor who has a kind heart, and has both ability and political integrity. Yun Qingkai yawned on the soft couch and heard Jin Huan report, "The Queen Mother sent someone to visit you, and they were in the front hall." "Okay." Yun Qingkai's tone was light and not at all agitated. Jin Huan looked confused. The Queen Mother had always tried her best to bring the Queen and Her Majesty together, and would often come to comfort the Queen because of their emotional discord. It stands to reason that since the Queen Mother is deliberately involved in this matter, the Queen Mother will do her best to seize this opportunity. That's it. He subconsciously said, "The Queen, do you want to see him?" As soon as the voice fell, a smiling voice came from outside, the Queen Mother has sent a servant to see you." Yunqing pulled the corners of his mouth without seriousness, and slowly got up from the couch, moved to the chair for the guests, and said, "Since Duke Zhou is here, then come in." Zhou Zhao stepped in, looking at the wounds on his body, hurriedly stepped forward, took a look eagerly, and sighed, "Hey, if the Queen Mother sees your injury, I'm afraid it will distressed." Yun Qingkai smiled slightly. If it were not for Zhou Zhao to strangle Yingxi to death with his own hands later, Yun Qingkai might not have thought of it, that he had always said that he was treated as his own, and he had always expressed his two-handed praise for him after Li Ying, and how terrible is the woman who helped him and Li Ying marry. From the very beginning, Li Ying approached him just because he wanted to get close to the Xiongfu through him, and Yun Qingkai fell in love with Li Ying because of her guidance. When he was just a teenager, he simply liked being with Li Ying. When we were together, it was the woman who broke it with one hand and asked him if he wanted to be with Li Ying forever, and if he wanted to marry Li Ying. And Yun Qingkai, step by step, got farther and farther away from his relatives, and got closer and closer to the enemy. "You have the Queen Mother," he said gently. "The father-in-law is here today, but what advice can you give?" Zhou Zhao was a little surprised by his calmness, but after considering Yun Qingkai's attitude towards the Queen Mother, he was quickly relieved. He signaled Yun Qingkai to let the attendant retreat, and said, "Your Majesty does not allow the Queen Mother to intervene in this matter. The time for a slave is not long, so I will make a long story short." Yun Qingkai nodded. According to the meaning of the Queen Mother, if the Queen wants to repair the relationship with Her Majesty at this moment, there is only one way, that is, may have to make the Queen suffer. Yun Qingkai listened respectfully. Zhou Zhao was a little puzzled. Logically speaking, Yun Qingkai at this time should continue to say, "As long as I can keep A Ying's heart, I am willing to do anything." That's right. Without waiting for the expected response, Zhou Zhao could only continue, "You also know that the Queen Mother has helped you a lot over the years, and Your Majesty also hates her deeply, so this time, I'm afraid that only Yun Xiang can save you. You know my relationship with him. That's because you don't want to kiss him, but he wants to be nice to you." Yun Qingkai's face was calm, but his fingers tightened silently. He grew up with his mother in another courtyard in the suburbs because of the discord between his parents. He returned to Xiongfu at the age of 7. In that year, his father took him on a trip with Emperor Xian and was accidentally assassinated at the same time. Pointing at Yun Qingkai and Emperor Xian, Yun Xiang gave Yun Qingkai a heavy glance, and flew towards the Emperor Xian. The sharp sword penetrated Yun Qingkai's chest. The father-son relationship that was too late to cultivate has worsened. Later, his mother and father completely broke, and Yun Qingkai never called him father again. Yun Qingkai took the tea and sipped lightly, and his long eyelashes suppressed all the emotions in his eyes. "You mean, let me beg him. Father and son are connected, as long as the Queen is cruel to toss herself, Yungxiang will surely feel soft." When he said this, he didn't blush or beat his heart, and he didn't feel guilty for instigating others to hurt himself. Yun Qingkai couldn't hold back, and laughed. "How stupid I was in my previous life, such obvious maliciousness could not be distinguished." He actually believed it. In order to force his father to seek Li Ying's plea, he abused himself like a mad, bruised himself all over, and the facts were as the Queen Mother expected. Yun Xiang really went away. He knelt in the Zhongshan temple for a day and a night, looking as if he was just an old father begging for forgiveness for his child, but the forces behind him inevitably made the young emperor think more about it. The emperor agreed to his request, not because of pity the world's parents, but after careful consideration. "I didn't want to offend the Yun family because of Yun Qingkai." Yun Qingkai still remembers the moment Yun Xiang came back. He struggled to sit up from the bed. Regardless of the bruises under his father's eyes and exhaustion, he asked anxiously, "Does he still want me?" The father looked at him with pity and pity. He looked at him for a long time before he said in a dumb voice, "Yes." Yun Qingkai Dang even laughed happily. Only Yun Qingkai was smiling, and everyone else showed a bleak expression. At that time, Yun Qingkai didn't care about anything. He only cared about Li Ying. It was not until later that Yun Qingkai understood that the cloud phase of that day must have determined the end of the Yun family. He knew that his kneeling, no matter how standard he was kneeling, no matter how humble, fell in the eyes of the emperor, it was a threat. But he couldn't threaten him openly, because Yun Qingkai was still in Li Ying's hands, and he threw a raid avoidance weapon. That's why, Li Ying became more and more afraid of the Yun family, and the Yun family was later found to have found evidence of party formation and private business. It was Yun Xiang's survival in the cracks, seeking a way out for the entire family. And all the evils started from this kneeling. This kneeling also caused Yun Xiang's always tough body to fall to the root of the disease. Who is the real family member? It's ridiculous that he was blind in his previous life. He believed in the enemy because of his prejudice against his father and pushed the whole family to death. But in fact, even if he did nothing, he would still be a queen. Even if Li Ying really wanted to abolish him, the queen mother would never allow it, because Yun Qingkai was her only bargaining chip to contain the Yun family. Zhou Zhao had doubts on his face. Why is the queen laughing? Yun Qingkai's heart was clear, his eyes were squiggly, and he asked instead, "Why does my father-in-law think I am laughing?" Zhou Zhao observed him for a few breaths. Yun Qingkai only smiled and looked at him. Even though Zhou Zhao had been in the palace for many years, he still had to admit that Yun Qingkai's face was really charming. After watching for a long time, you will forget your true purpose. He looked away and guessed that Yun Qingkai should be just happy to find a way to stay inseparable from the emperor. Anyway, Yun Qingkai is always crazy in dealing with the emperor. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a little contemptuous. He showed a somewhat good expression and said, "The servant is waiting for the good news from the queen." Yun Qingkai nodded indifferently, "Well, father-in-law, walk slowly." After Zhou Zhao left, Yun Qingkai suppressed a smile. The window was pushed open vigorously, and the cold wind poured in, and the squiggly eyes became cold in the wind and snow. Yun Qing had no regrets for loving Li Ying. The only thing he regretted was that he loved too much and didn't leave himself with a half-point card. When he was dying, he could only be slaughtered. Never again. In this life, he wants to his relatives and let Li Ying's mother and son open their eyes to see clearly how they are afraid of the Yun family, who is in power, will divide half of the Li family under their noses. The wind is strong. Zhou Zhaoxing was not far from the gate of Xiangfu. When he encountered an unknown carriage hurriedly, he did not want to care, but suddenly saw a person walking by the car with his sleeves copying his sleeves. He slipped his feet and hurried up to meet him. "Gentlemen." Lu Ziru glanced at him and said, "Hurry up and get your car away." Zhou Zhao hurriedly ordered people to drive the car aside, watching the emperor's car hurried by, wondering, why is it so anxious? Inside the car, the man stopped rubbing his cuff fingers and said, "Bring him on." Lu Ziru waved, and the two imprisoned soldiers following the car stepped forward and grabbed Zhou Zhao. The latter was immediately taken aback. "Your Majesty, what does your Majesty mean?" Lu Ziru frowned, but he was actually at a loss. His Majesty came in a hurry today, as if he was worried about something. As an internal supervisor, he didn't mind selling Zhou Zhao a favor, and whispered, "Your Majesty is in a bad mood." Zhou Zhao got it through at one point and shut up immediately. When the master is in a bad mood, it will be easier to live more honestly than to make noise. What's more, going to Yun Xiang's house is not bad at this moment. Not surprisingly, Yun Qingkai should have been in trouble, and the emperor will definitely be even more disgusted when he sees him going crazy with his own eyes. It's also a good show. He had just finished thinking about it, and there was a sudden cold behind him, and he looked back stiffly, and saw that the carriage curtain moved slightly, and it seemed that the person inside had just opened it and glanced at him. A short glance, but no one knows what that glance means. The cold air rose from the solace of the feet. Zhou Zhao's face turned pale. Could it be, the emperor knew that he came this time to encourage the queen to self-harm? Li Ying's carriage stopped outside the gate of Xiangfu. Lu Ziru personally went to call the door, and Yun Xiang quickly greeted the two elder brothers with Yun Qingkai in a hurry. Please also forgive your majesty. He bent over to worship, and a pair of powerful hands caught him firmly. Teacher is too polite. Yungxiang taught in the Imperial College. The first emperor was in a hurry. Li Ying was only 13 years old when he became the throne. However, Yungxiang and Lu Ziru glanced at the hand of the emperor's helper at the same time, which seemed to be too intimate. Yungxiang got up without leaving a trace, and said, "Please come inside. I don't know if your majesty comes here in the snow, what you are doing." All the voices were gone in an instant, and Li Ying stopped. His eyes passed through the broken snow floating in the sky, and landed far in the carved corridor of Xiangfu. One person wrapped in a large cloak of mink fur, with white gauze on his head, and his hands were placed on the white cuffs, and walked unhurriedly. Li Ying watched for a moment. Lu Ziru hurriedly stepped forward 2 steps and put the oil paper umbrella on top of his head. He glanced at Li Ying and then at Yun Qingkai. As they got closer, their eyes met in one place. Yun Qingkai was stunned for a moment. Li Ying's hands naturally hung beside him, slightly lifted to the sides. He was waiting for Yun Qingkai to rush over and pounce in his arms as before. Not only him, but everyone present, including Yun Xiang, thought so. I don't know how to give birth to such an evil species, and I can't walk when I see a man. Zhiziemo Ruofu, such an emperor came in person, and there is no need to think about what Yun Qingkai will be like. Even if people are not looking for him, he will brainstorm that people are looking for him. Obviously, the injuries on his head have not been scabs. Yun Xiang said aside. The Yun family's elder brother looked indifferent. Everyone in the Yun family knew that Yun Qingkai was born to collect debts, and all the debts collected were paid to the Li family. Yun Qingkai quickly returned to his senses, taking in all the expressions of everyone, and then walked quickly with a smile on his face. Li Ying moved his toes forward by half an inch, ready to meet, but saw Yun Qingkai stop 3 feet in front of him. Respectfully, the minister sees your majesty. The forward toes withdrew silently, and the raised hand came back to his side. Except for the person involved, no one noticed this tiny movement. The man restrained his hands behind him, and looked at his queen for a moment. Yun Xiang looked back, and the Yun family brother present also showed a different color. Yun Qingkai glanced at his father, opened his mouth, and was swallowed before he could say father. He had hardly yelled in his previous life, and it was really embarrassing for him to yell out, so he changed his mouth and said, "Why are you standing in the yard doing such a heavy snowfall?" "Yes." Yungxiang reacted quickly. He looked at him more and said to Li Ying, "Your Majesty, let's go in quickly." Li Ying withdrew his gaze in silence and strode into the front hall. Yun Qingkai followed behind and received an inquiring sight from 2 older brothers. Yun Xiang raised his head in front of the emperor for the first time, straightened his waist slightly, arranged for him to sit down in the main seat, and ordered people to have tea, and asked again, "Your Majesty is coming today in the snow, but there is what's important." Li Ying picked up the tea cup, raised his eyes and looked at Yun Qingkai. It happened that Yun Qingkai was also looking at him suspiciously. His eyes met, and the latter smiled slightly, very gentle and obedient, and very polite and distant. Yun Qingkai had never thought that one day he could look at Li Ying in such a calm manner, as if he were treating a stranger. Of course, perhaps he is not as good as a stranger to Li Ying. Li Ying stared at Yun Qingkai, saying every word, I came to pick up the emperor and return to the palace." Yun Qingkai. The arrival of Li Ying was already very unbelievable, but actually came to pick him back to the palace? The Queen Mother forced him to come? Impossible, not to mention that the Queen Mother encouraged him to succeed in self-harm in his previous life. Even if Li Ying came to pick him up is indeed her last move, it should be after confirming that he did not self-harm. How long has Zhou Zhaogang made a move? How did she know that she would not self-harm and threaten her father like before? Besides, how could Li Ying's temperament listen to her arrangements? At most, she sent Lu Xiru for a cut scene under her painstaking efforts. How could he come in person? Yun Qingkai was puzzled, and Yun Xiang on one side also came to see Yun Qingkai. The latter was confused and said, "But, Your Majesty said that I should return to Xiangfu to recover. My injury has not been healed yet." Li Ying squeezed the teacup tightly, his black eyes rolled out of waves. Lu Xiru's heart trembled. What is Yun Qingkai doing? Your Majesty came to pick him up personally. What kind of temper is there at this time? Crazy? He hurriedly finished the battle and said, "Your Majesty also heard that the Queen was injured when she returned to the palace yesterday." He thought that the Forbidden City Thai Hospital gathered the masters and went back after picking up the king. It was also for your injury considerations. Yun Qingkai didn't eat this set. Although he died 8 years later, even after so many years, he will never forget that Li Ying threw him off the bed and drove him back to Xiangfu after he cut his wrist. The original words were, "Return to Xiangfu to recuperate after sending you off." Although he didn't understand why Li Ying in this life had acted completely differently from the previous life, he would never let Li Ying Zhao come and go. Yun Qingkai raised his eyes, just about to speak, when suddenly an old voice came, "The great hospital gathers wonderful hands." Yun Xiang caressed his long beard. When the Queen came back yesterday, there were only injuries on his wrists and head, and he needed to find a doctor in the mansion. Now he accidentally added new injuries in the mansion. To hospital, really look at it. This is almost as close as pointing at Li Ying's nose and cursing directly. Why did you forget that the hospital gathered your master when you sent people back yesterday? At this moment, I want to take the people back, and come up with this kind of rhetoric again. When my youngest son of the Yun family is really unprotected. Lu Xiru heard clearly, his face was slightly embarrassed, and subconsciously looked at the emperor secretly. In the past, although Yungxiang was dissatisfied with Yun Qingkai's dead skin and his face wrapped around the emperor, Yun Qingkai was paranoid and wayward, and hated him for his bones, which was beyond his control. Even though he was anxious to catch Yun Qingkai before, Yun Qingkai did not accept his affection at all. Now Yun Qingkai suddenly changed his temper to rely on his father, seeing that Master Yun's liver and spleen are smooth, and he is proud of supporting his cubs. How can this be done? The author has something to say, Ci Bao, don't fix it, let it be buried. Ms. Ri Ying, I think I can still save it. What Yun Xiang said was exactly what Yun Qingkai wanted to say. It's just that he didn't expect that his father would turn his madness and ambiguity into an accident, and the accusation he exported was almost unmodified. The other party was Li Ying. The clouds of the previous life were always humble, even cautious, in front of Li Ying. His back was always slightly squatted. He was obviously a ruler, a teacher, and a student, but he looked like a master and servant. Thinking about it now, he was basically hoping that Li Ying could treat his unsuspecting child a little bit better from his attitude of surrender. Unfortunately, not only did Li Ying bear Yun Qingkai, but he also never stopped guarding the Yun family. He did what he was supposed to do, but didn't keep it on either side. He was angry and aggrieved, but Yun Qingkai was paranoid and stubborn, and he loved Li Yingge so madly, so he was timid. In his previous life, he had never straightened up in front of Li Ying in his entire life. The knuckles of Li Ying's fingers pinched on the teacup turned white. He finally looked away from Yun Qingkai's face and faced Yun Xiang sideways. Teacher is not angry, after hurting you yesterday, it is indeed my fault. Your Majesty is serious. Yun Xiang said, it is the old minister who has no choice but to teach his son. He has angered His Majesty and damaged the royal face. Now that he is back now, the minister will strictly discipline him and will never let him do it again. The matter of humiliating the queen's identity. To say what Yun Qingkai did to humiliate his identity is nothing but to love him desperately and love him too much. Yun Qingkai drooped down his eyelashes and pinched the corners of his mouth. It turns out that this is the feeling of being backed by his father. If he can wake up early in his previous life, close to his father and brother, and far away from the Queen Mother, even if he just keeps a proper distance from both sides, he will not fall into that field. Yun Xiang's refusal was obvious enough. He clearly expressed his dissatisfaction with the emperor's injury to Yun Qingkai, causing him to roll back in a coma. In the past, Yun Qingkai wanted to post it upside down, and he was happy, so that's fine. Now that Yun Qingkai has resisted, the Yun family is undoubtedly his biggest backer. And protecting him from going back to the palace at this moment, and kneeling and begging for goodbye from the previous life, this time, he has a good reason and stand, but also has enough confidence and dignity. Li Ying pressed the tip of his tongue. He had never softened his attitude to anyone. Yun Qingkai only had to look at his expression to know that he must be at a loss at this moment. He was even more confused. Why did Li Ying come this time? What made him change his temper? He was born again? Even if he is born again, with his temperament, it is impossible to be so low-pitched towards the Yun family. Yun Qingkai knows him too well. He only sees the Li family's Zhongshan and Dai, and everyone is just a chess piece in his hand. Some of the concubines in the harem were used by him to hold Yun Qingkai in order to let Yun Qingkai indulge in the struggles in the harem without time to bother him, and some were the daughters of the ministers he was going to get rid of to contain the ministers. Therefore, if Li Ying is given a chance to come back, he does not need to be afraid to listen to the Queen Mother. He will definitely take this opportunity to sever ties with Yun Qingkai, and throw away Yun Qingkai with his methods and information. He quickly raised the Xiongfu, severing all the wings of the Yun family, making Yun Xiang a nameless. Yun Qingkai directly ruled out this possibility. He only doubted whether Li Ying was brewing any bigger conspiracy. Lu Xiru deserves to be the emperor's most caring person. He smiled and said, the grandfather should consider the overall situation, and the harem should not be left alone for a day. Concubine Ning is the daughter of Shou. She has both talents and learning. She should be able to take over the palace temporarily. Li Ying's face went gloomy. Lu Xiru was a little bit ashamed. This time the Empress and the Emperor had such a big conflict because the Emperor did not refuse Ning Fei's invitation on the eve of the Emperor. Yun Qing could do everything for him, and the only thing he could not accept was to get close to others. He directly led people into Concubine Ning's bedroom and held her down in front of the Emperor. Concubine Ning yelled for help. The Emperor drank some wine, his expression was slightly drunk, and calmly calmed, I am just here for a little wine, and I am not going to spend the night. In that case, A Ying will follow me back to the palace. Go later. The Emperor looked at the trembling concubine Ning, was silent for a few breaths, made a relaxed attitude, and said, let her go first. They will always have trouble with each other for this reason. In the past 2 years, Yun Qingkai has caught him more than once, and he has made trouble more than once. He has been extremely dissatisfied with Li Ying's behavior. Lu Xiru could see clearly. Yun Qingkai took a step forward, approached Li Ying sitting at the table, and pierced a drug-dipped silver needle into the opponent's arm. The latter did not defend him at all, and immediately lost consciousness. Ching, Yun Qingkai smoothly pressed his head to his abdomen, and despite Lu Xiru's dissuasion, ordered someone to carry the opponent back to his bedroom. He was standing jade, with murderous intent overflowing between his brows. Whoever dares to touch my A Ying is to dig out my heart and liver, I will let her die. Concubine Ning never dreamed that Yun Qingkai would be so arrogant, her face was pale and shivering on one side. It is said that after Yun Qing resigned and returned to the palace, he also lit the incense for sleeping. The emperor was unconscious, Yifan fierce, cough, In short, the emperor was more obedient that night, and he was more angry when he was sober. According to Lu Xiru's thoughts, Yun Qingkai did the wrong thing about this matter. It was the emperor's body. How could he be allowed to play and humiliate in this way, not to mention that he could actually be regarded as an assassination? Therefore, Li Ying just broke his forehead and threw him out that morning, instead of directly smashing him into pieces. It was already a great grace. But Yungxiang also said at this moment. Yunqing didn't understand the rules, and his domineering waywardness angered his majesty. It was his godson who had no choice. Since his majesty sent him back, it was for him to discipline and teach. Is it true that he will be strict? It's hard to say to add discipline, but after all, I don't want to release people anymore. Li Ying was probably also aggrieved. He looked down for a moment and said, I want to say a few words with the queen alone. He came to Yun Qingkai, avoided the injured wrist of the opponent, and directly dragged him out of the front hall. Yun Qingkai raised his eyebrows. Even through the thick clothes, he was still in pain from his excessive strength. Your Majesty. His waist hit the corridor guardrail. Li Ying stepped forward and trapped him between his arms. Looking at his pale face, his patience and anger were slightly reduced. He calmed his emotions and restrained. You really want to stay in Xiangfu? Yun Qingkai's both wrists were in pain. He put his hands on his side, his fingertips trembling slightly, and said, Father is right, the harem can be controlled by concubine Ning. Enough. Li Ying interrupted him. Yun Qingkai, you really think you are not at all wrong? Is all this my fault? He has come to pick him up, he doesn't care about the previous complaints. What is Yun Qingkai's reaction now? This is too far from what he expected, and Yun Qingkai shouldn't be like this. Unless, that's impossible, he can't accept it. Of course I am at fault. Yun Qingkai said piously, Your Majesty's body of 10,000 gold is my boldness. If Your Majesty feels that I am like this, I still can't understand my hatred. He paused and gave a suggestion, stick me too. What is your attitude now? I'm sorry. Yun Qingkai sighed and said, It's all my fault, please calm down your anger. Still in that calm attitude, neither accusing nor complaining, his turbulent mood seemed to have no effect on him. Yun Qingkai wanted to make a tantrum with him as to which link went wrong. Li Ying furrowed his brows and propped his arms on the rear guardrail, so that he could get closer to Yun Qingkai. He restrained, Yun Qingkai, you want to be clear, I will only come to pick you up this time. Things were out of his control, he resorted to habitual threats. What Yun Qingkai fears most is being abandoned by him and tired of him. As long as Li Ying does not look for others, Yun Qingkai will assume the most humble attitude. Carefully please him, whether in life or in private. As long as he hooked his finger, Yun Qingkai would rub him affectionately, lying on his knees. He couldn't find a better way to communicate with Yun Qingkai for a while, so he could only use this bad method. Yun Qingkai lowered his eyebrows and did not answer. There is a good smell on his body, which is unique to Yun Qingkai. His face is as indistinguishable from the memory. It will make people lose sight of it after a long time. Li Ying's Adam's apple rolled, and couldn't help approaching him. Every inch of his skin was crazily longing for him. He missed him, thinking almost madly. The cold Susan at night pressed against the tip of his heart. He always thought of the large cinnabar splashed in the snow, and the ice muscle and bones lying in it. But it permanently loses its color. Sometimes he suddenly opens his eyes and asks gloomily, Li Ying, why don't you cherish me? Yun Qingkai moved his arms back and leaned back. He noticed that the other party's eyes were gradually blurred, and he subconsciously tilted his head, avoiding the kiss that almost fell on his lips. Li Ying's chin was placed a few inches on his shoulder, and the raised Adam's apple was connected to the chin line, making a beautiful arc, and his expression was unclear. Yun Qingkai felt that he was ill, but here was the Xiangfu. As long as his father moved his feet, he could see them from the front hall, and his blood would surge. He was short and got out from under Li Ying's arm. He turned his back to the opponent and said, I think I should really learn how to be a qualified queen. This should satisfy Li Ying. In his previous life, he ran into Li Ying too many times in the name of love. Li Ying sometimes pointed at his nose and yelled at him. How could there be such an arrogant and jealous queen in history who would even go to sleep in someone's palace? It's all about it. But Yun Qingkai could not forget. When he first got married, he made a promise to himself. Later, when the imperial concubine entered the palace, Yun Qingkai was very afraid that he would like others. Li Ying also comforted him. He had a queen. Now, my harem is just a fake. But everything changed. In the end, only Yun Qingkai still kept in mind the so-called each other's alliance than Jin Jian. He only regarded Li Ying as an ordinary man, but Li Ying had never forgotten that he was the king of a country. In this life, he will remember the identity of the other party, and if not necessary, it is best not to conflict with him. Li Ying moved his hands on the guardrail and straightened his back. They carried each other on their sides, their shoulders formed a right angle, and the wind swept the snow into the corridor, spinning away at the right angle. Li Ying moved, and the tall figure passed by him, leaving a sentence, okay. He walked through the front hall without looking back, and Lu Xiru hurriedly followed up, raising his voice, Your Majesty is back. Shut up. Li Ying said. Lu Xiru's long chanting stopped abruptly, and he trot down to keep up with his footsteps. Zhou Zhao looked towards the corridor with a dazed expression. He couldn't believe that His Majesty was really just here to pick up Yun Qing's speech, let alone that he didn't pick it up. Li Ying stepped on the step stool and got into the carriage, got into it and no one was seen. The carriage hurried, as if fleeing. Brother Yun family braved the wind and snow and bowed together, Send Your Majesty respectfully. Yun Qingkai came to the front hall again, his father and elder brother just came in one after another. Yungxiang's smile faded slightly, and he sat aside without saying a word and touched the teacup. Yun Qingxiao's expression was complicated, but Yun Qingsu asked him directly, Why don't you follow him? The prince of a country, come and pick you up personally, it would be nice for you to make a trip for nothing. Yun Qingsu said reprimanding, but his eyebrows were full of flying looks, and he deliberately said, Why? Courageous fat, I'm afraid he doesn't want you anymore. For old. Yun Qingxiao started to drink softly. Yun Qingsu glanced at the appearance of his younger brother being trained, raised his hand and touched his nose, and said, It was originally, wasn't it a joke yesterday? Toss, see who hurts. He shut his mouth under his father's eyes. Yun Qingxiao sat on the side in silence. Even at home, he was always strict and meticulous. Yun Qingsu stopped speaking, and the atmosphere in the hall became a little awkward. Hey! Uncle Ding, the old housekeeper of the Yun family, suddenly patted his thigh and said, It's lunch time now, sir, shall we have dinner? Yun Qingkai only then remembered that he took the initiative to come out. In fact, he wanted to have lunch with his father and brother. The other members of the Yun family did not express their opinions, and the old housekeeper arrogantly began to talk about it, and soon the family gathered around the dining table. Yun Qingswan buried his head and ate hard, until he was kicked by the second brother. He choked out a grain of rice, and said, Emperor, when are you going to go back? In the next instant, Yun Xiang and Yun Qingxiao's eyes stared coldly on his face. Letting you speak to ease the atmosphere is not about letting you pick which pot without opening it. Wait to heal your injury first. Raise in the mansion. As soon as Yun Qingsu finished speaking, Yun Xiang suddenly pushed the bowls and chopsticks, got up and left the dining room. Before leaving, gave Yun Qingsu a fierce look. Yun Qingxiao held his chopsticks and said in a calm tone, You should eat. Yun Qingkai raised his eyes in confusion, and said naturally, Of course. The old housekeeper hurriedly followed Yungxiang's pace and said, They are not much different in age. The little son was like before, and it is normal for the fourth son to not respond at the moment. Yungxiang frowned and said, he still wants to go back. I think the young man's position today is still very clear, or else, you can just say that you want him to reconcile. No. Yungxiang waved his hand and said, we don't know what he thinks now. If we rashly make this request, if we hate him again. Are you suspicious? The young man is trying to catch him. The old butler sighed, if this is the case, it will be difficult. In this carriage, the carriage returned to the palace. Li Ying got off the carriage and went straight to the Zhongshan temple. Zhou Zhao watched his footsteps like the wind, obviously he was angered to the extreme by Yun Qingkai. Thinking of the Queen Mother's instructions, he hurriedly followed, Your Majesty, your sire calms down your anger. Today, you will pick it up in person. The Queen is so innocent and she doesn't know how to raise her. Her old man has a way. The wind's footsteps stopped suddenly. Zhou Zhao glanced at Lu Xiru subconsciously, who looked at him like a dead person. He reacted very quickly, and knelt down with a thud, the slave talks a lot, please forgive me. The posture is extremely standard, but he is not afraid in his heart. Among the three masters in the harem, Yun Qingkai is the only horrible person. The emperor is kind, and the queen mother is even more amiable. It doesn't matter. Anyway, they didn't really treat Yun Qingkai as their own. The mysterious boots embroidered with gold thread in front of him went away. Zhou Zhao just breathed a sigh of relief, when he heard a sound of Kang Li Ying drew the long sword hanging on the wall. Headed by Lu Xiru, the people around knelt down. Zhou Zhao stiffened all over, seeing the familiar boots come back, and stopped in front of him, the gleaming sword pressed heavily on his neck. The big beads of sweat fell down. Your Majesty! The voice was as cold as a sharp knife. The Queen Mother asked you to go to Xiangfu, what did you say to the Queen? Your Majesty suspected that he had communicated the news to the Queen, that is why the Queen refused to come back? No, no, no. Zhou Zhao waved his hand again and again, the Queen Mother really just asked the minions to visit, Your Majesty must not misunderstand, even if the Queen Mother said anything, it is all for the good of you and the Queen. The long sword sharpened like mud was picked up, and half of his ears fell to the ground. Lu Xiru's pupils contracted, and he couldn't believe that he would really do it. The people around him fell to the ground, their thighs trembled, and they didn't dare to breathe. A brief silence. Warm blood slid down from behind the ears. It hurts, but Zhou Zhao didn't dare to scream, because the long sword was still on his shoulders. Li Ying didn't say anything, but all his actions made it clear that he could not get a satisfactory answer. Next time, he would drop something his head. Madam, Queen Mother, let the minion give advice to the Queen, to save your Majesty. Go on. As long as the Queen can abuse herself, the Master will definitely come to intercede for him. Zhou Zhao kowtowed like crazy, the slave has absolutely no false words, Your Majesty has shown that the slave has never deliberately instigated discord. Don't let the Queen return to the palace. How many times is it? First, really the first time, the Queen is afraid of pain, before, no, never. Zhou Zhao cried weakly, slowly lying on the ground, not daring to raise his head again. Look, my heart is bleak. Doesn't your Majesty hate the Queen? Why is it suddenly maintained now? The long sword trembled, and Li Ying looked grim, you still know that he is afraid of pain. Lu Xiru's face twitched, and he finally knew why Li Ying was so angry. The Emperor and the Queen had a cold war before. Lu Xiru often dealt with between the two of them. He once saw Yun Qingkai making gestures on his wrist with something, but every time when you see him, you will be cold and don't start. Yun Qingkai also had his own pride. He didn't know how many psychological constructions he had done secretly before he collapsed and started hurting himself yesterday. It's no wonder that his personality has become more and more extreme in the past 2 years, and his behavior has become more and more fierce. Your Majesty! Lu Xiru took 2 steps on his knees and said, Your Majesty calms down his anger. It is not a pity for Zhou Zhao's death, but now the queen is still in Xiangfu. If he learns about this, in case he is frightened. This is quite euphemistic. Li Ying's change was so sudden that Lu Xiru couldn't adapt to it for a while. If Yun Qingkai knew about it, I'm afraid it would be even more outrageous. Would he dare not return to the palace because he was afraid of Li Ying? The reason is actually far-fetched, but Lu Xiru, as the prisoner of the emperor, must remind him to always correct his words and deeds. After all, he is the king of a country. Besides, what Yun Qingkai likes has always been the gentle and decent Li Ying. I don't know if Li Ying cares about the emperor's face, or more about Yun Qing's speech, but after all he lost his sword and walked into the table behind the screen. Lu Xiru ordered someone to take Zhou Zhao to the hospital, and while picking up the sword on the ground, he warned everyone not to spoil the virtues of the emperor, and then wiped the sword and hung it up again to follow up. The emperor was sitting behind the table without a word. He used to overturn the table when Yun Qing was too angry. Lu Xiru could still speak to comfort him, but now the still water is deep, and there is no half waves on the surface. He has no way of starting. Sir, don't you think I'm crazy? No. Li Ying laughed strangely, then lowered his eyes and said, I'm crazy. Lu Xiru didn't dare to talk, but he knew what Li Ying wanted most at the moment, and he skillfully changed the subject. Snow in the past few days, and then the ice-ripe festival. The next few days will be very lively. Your Majesty, do you want to accompany you? Later, I went to Kanglan Lake for a stroll. The minister remembered that the queen used to like it very much. Ice festival. Xiangfu, Yun Qingkai unexpectedly raised his eyes while smashing the bright red plum petals in the mortar, and said in doubt, Fourth brother is going with me. Father said that you are bored at home all day, which is not conducive to recuperating. Yun Qingsu sat down opposite him, squeezed the snack in the plate and put it in his mouth, saying, I was supposed to let my second brother accompany you, but the criminal department, if things are busy, let me take you there. Yun Qingxiao is the minister of the criminal ministry and is in charge of the prison. Most of the time he is involved in cases. The third brother Yun Qingjun, as the deputy commander of Sixiying, has to go to the military camp every day. The rest is in the patrol department. Mixed Yun Qingsu with the position of captain. Yun Qingkai's eyes lit up, and he said happily, okay. In the past few days, Yun Qingkai has not been too close except to eat with his family every day. Most of the time he stayed at home by himself. He was very unique in his previous life, and he was a little unable to adapt for a while. Father and brother's initiative to get close, undoubtedly made him a lot easier. Yun Qingsu did not dare to say that his father let him get close to Yun Qingkai actually had other purposes. He hoped that they, brothers, would be able to push their hearts out when Yun Qingkai finally let go of their guards, and let Yun Qingkai feel that they are the closest relatives. People. Then, to persuade him to make peace with Li Ying. Yun Qingsu was actually a little unwilling in his heart. After his mother passed away, Yun Qingkai completely severed his relationship with the Yun family. Now that he has been wronged by others, he knows that he has come back to look for his father and brother. Why did he go? He twisted on the chair, his eyes fell on the happy face of the younger brother, thinking that it was almost the time to bring the words, let's withdraw. Yun Qingkai watched him walking around, wondering if he couldn't bear his curiosity, or he was looking for a topic, and asked, what are you doing with it? Make paint. Yun Qingkai earnestly explained, this flower juice is very upright and can be used on ceramics. The temperature is well controlled, and the burnt color is very bright. Why did you suddenly think of doing this? Because he always clings to Li Ying. In order to make him less clingy, Li Ying found many gentlemen for him. He wanted to distract him from his time and attention. Yun Qingkai learned everything to make him happy. He even burned a superb glaze in his previous life and happily took it to Li Ying to show his learning results. That day, Li Ying happened to be back from the chamber, and was extremely unhappy because of the tight frontier warfare. It was annoying to see him. Fell to him easily. The master teacher who taught Yun Qingkai to burn porcelain heard that he was very angry and screamed for violent death. Yun Qing's brows were slightly cold, and he smiled again, and said, "You can sell it for money, and don't you like it? I want to burn him a superb glaze." "This is a surprise, brother, don't tell him secretly." Yun Qingsu was in a daze, and then replied, "You want, give father, give a gift." Yet, Yun Qingkai lowered his head, continued to make the juice, and said, "I want to make daddy happy." Yun Qingsu didn't think he could burn anything good, but this intention was enough to make him feel soft. He raised his hand to touch Yun Qingkai's head, and then silently shrank back. Although Yun Qingkai refused to let him say, Yun Qingsu still did not hold back, and as soon as he left the yard, he went straight to the main house. "Father, Xiaosai said that he would give you a surprise." Yun Xiang couldn't understand that he was so old and rude, and his tone was light. "It's a surprise to say everything, what else are you here to say to me?" "Oh." Yun Qingsu was splashed with cold water and said blankly, "It's the kid who talks too much." He turned around to leave, and was stopped again. Yun Xiang sternly asked, "What surprise?" Yun Qingsu snickered and turned dignifiedly, "It is the best glaze, and you have never seen it." When Yun Xiang heard it, he knew that it was an empty cannon. "You young people just don't know the sky and the earth, how much does he know about this? You also follow the word, even if you burn a kill for a lifetime, you don't dare to pack a ticket to produce the best." "That's what he said anyway, you believe it or not." Yongxiang snorted and waved him to get out. On the second day of the court, Han Shangshu, the official secretary, quietly leaned in front of Yongxiang. "I heard that your majesty went to the mansion the day before." Head Yunxiang said casually, "How do you know?" Someone recognized Mr. Lu in front of the car. Han Shangshu sighed, and said, "Why do you wipe the face of the emperor, and let the king follow him back?" Yongxiang shook his head. Even in front of an old friend, he didn't confess his whole feelings, but said, "Your majesty is not specifically to pick him up. You haven't heard anything about Xiaosai. So that's it." Han Shangshu suddenly realized, just say that your majesty has not achieved his goal, so how can he give up easily? Yun Xiang pretended to sigh sadly, and Han Shangshu patted him comfortably on the shoulder, "But now that the queen is willing to live in Xiangfu, you can feel relieved." When Yun Qingkai went back to the door, he just went to Xiangfu for a cut scene, and went straight back to the outskirts where he lived with his mother when he was a child. The discord between father and son can be said to be well known. Yongxiang nodded, and said mysteriously, "Have you ever seen the best glaze? You know how to do it, and true glaze picking is something you can never find." Han Shangshu is not angry, "If you have it, you will all be sent to the palace." Would I have seen it? Yongxiang was immediately attuned and comfortable. Everyone knew that the best glazes could not be found, but Yun Qingkai had the heart to give him a best glaze. This day of filial piety, who else has it? Of course he knew that Yun Qingkai couldn't be burned, so he didn't say enough. Anyway, his mind was enough for him to be happy for a long time. Han Shangshu said again, "Speaking of this, Bajhanju seems to have produced a boutique. I heard that Tai Weiqiu has already said hello in advance. Would you like to go see you together?" Yun Xiang was surprised, "Bajhan House?" He remembered that he also said hello. "Master Yun." A voice came from behind, and Han Shangshu smiled and turned his head to greet him, "Prince Chu." Yun Xiang's expression was faint, and Tai Weiqiu held his hand forward with a worried look. "I heard that Xiao Ci was injured at home to recuperate, I don't know how it is now. Isn't the injury serious? If Mr. Lao is concerned, everything is fine for children. I wanted to ask my wife to visit, but I also thought that your Yun family has no female relatives, which is not very convenient, so I have to come and inquire myself." "Xiaosai, are you still obedient?" The Yun family had only 2 female relatives. The eldest sister married Shou Fang Jidu early, and now she is stationed in Lingzhou with her husband and cannot return to Beijing unless summoned. Micah has been in a coma because Yun Qingkai was assassinated. She was in poor health, and she became ill with anxiety. The 8-year-old Yun Qingkai woke up from a coma and saw her mother lying next to her pillow. He thought the other party was too tired to take care of him and fell asleep. The frail Yun Qingkai reluctantly ate something, and then touched her, only to realize that her body was cold and she died guarding him. Yun Qingkai always believed that although his father did not directly kill him, he indirectly killed his mother. Everyone knows everything about the Yun family. When Yun Qingkai was in a coma, the Micah and Yungxiang completely broke off and he was not allowed to visit another courtyard. So Yun Qingkai did not let Yungxiang attend the funeral. Xianzhai didn't bother her seriously, just followed from a distance and watched until she was sealed in the tomb forever. Chu Taiwei's words were damning, but Yun Xiang always looked calm. He thought of the well-behaved and sensible young son these past few days, and even smiled. We won't talk about housework here. If Taiwei is interested, we can go to the tea house. Sit down, I just want to know the current situation of Chu Weiqiuyang's 2 students. Those were the 3rd and 4th sons of Taiwei Chu, and they had to call Yungxiang a teacher. One of the 2 brothers is unlearned and skillless but can only play with wood, and the other spends a lot of time to go to places where there are many girls. Except for the elder son Chu Xian, which is quite worry-free, these 2 are simply here to him off. Taiwei Chu sneered, no matter how my children from the Chu family are, I haven't chased a man all day long. Now, Your Majesty has confiscated even when he returns to the door to drive his car. Look, after Mr. Yun, who can't live without His Majesty, what good show will be staged for us? He walked away. Yun Xiang narrowed his eyebrows slightly, which was also what he worried the most. The most urgent matter at the moment is that Yun Qingkai should dispel the desire to arrest as soon as possible, and completely reconcile with the emperor. He bid farewell to Han Shangshu, I have to go to Bachhanju again. Good things can't be snatched by the enemy. Sweji, the Kanglin Lake is frozen with thick ice, and the ice play festival is here. Yun Qingkai had scabs on his forehead, so he took off the gauze. Fortunately, the brim of the winter hat was so large that it could block the wound. He got up early in the morning, packed himself up, and went out with the 4th brother in the car. Li Ying was a step late, and Lu Ziru came back from the front door and replied, the Empress and the 4th young master have gone out together, and it is also the Kanglin Lake. Vendors have gathered by the side of Kanglin Lake, crowds are turbulent, snow is everywhere on a clear day, and the sky is white and blue, and the sky is beautiful. Yun Qingkai stepped out of the carriage and closed his eyes and took a breath. The cold snow gas entered his lungs, making his body refreshed. A familiar voice came, Qingsu. Yun Qingkai raised his eyes, and Yun Qingsu had already greeted him, Master Xiaohe. Princess Yan Zhao's only son, Li Ying's childhood companion, Lin Huijin. All of them had studied under the superintendent of the kingdom. He had a good relationship with Yun Qingsu. To be precise, he had a good relationship with Li Ying and Yun Qingkai. More than a year ago, Yun Qingzang killed a palace slave who was close to Li Ying. Lin Huijin happened to pass by, relying on his own year-old age and his former love, and severely reprimanded Yun Qingkai, and the 2 had a few quarrels. Later, Li Ying arrived. At that time, Li Ying still knew to say good things for him. He told Lin Huijin, he is not by nature like this, but he loves me too much, and I will take care of him. Yun Qingkai never understood why Li Ying would say such relatively private words in front of Lin Huijin, but at that time he was extremely useful, and he thought Li Ying understood him. Later, when he was beaten into the cold palace, Lin Huijin went to help him intercede with Li Ying. Even if the Xiongfu party is guilty, what crime does the queen have? For so many years, can you really not see his heart? Have you forgotten your majesty? He also questioned Li Ying in front of Yun Qingkai. you said that he is not paranoid by nature, just because he loves you. Now, you want to cure his sin with arrogance and domineering, could it be this? Is it your Majesty's plan to kill? Li Ying dragged him out in a rage, hitting 20 big boards. It was not until then that Yun Qingkai knew that Li Ying was not talking to him, but to Lin Huijin. With noises in his ears, Yun Qingkai's face was as delicate as ever, and the white brim of his hat was even more clever and pleasant. Lin Huijin stepped forward and bowed to the courtesy, "See Empress." "Call Xiaosai." Yun Qingsu said, "There are so many people with mixed eyes, so it's safe." Lin Huijin was silent for a while, her voice hoarse, "Xiao Ci." Not far away, Li Ying's carriage stopped, he lifted the driving curtain, and saw Lin Huijin next to Yun Qingkai. Lu Xiru instantly felt the surrounding temperature drop rapidly. The Ice Festival is a folk festival, but sometimes the Emperor will also participate in the fun with the people and chase on the ice wearing ice shoes. It is a winter event that Yasukuni is extremely fond of. Originally, this year the Ministry of Etiquette also required someone to make arrangements, and at the same time inform the security of the camps to make preparations in advance, but the paper was reported and was suppressed by the Emperor, who had just had a fight with the Queen, so the matter was not resolved. This matter has spread to the people. When Yun Qingkai and Lin Huijin were walking together, they heard someone comment, "I think Kanglin Lake is a private charter this time. Isn't Your Majesty coming this year? Don't you know? Your Majesty is so annoying lately, how can I still have the heart to be happy with us? How do I say this? It's not that Empress Yun's domineering jealousy angered Your Majesty. I heard that people were driven out directly. My brother who worked in the palace can tell me. This time, Empress Yun may have difficulty turning over. I've heard about this Empress Yun too, but I really don't like Your Majesty. It's true. I don't know what to think. He can't give birth to a child, and he won't let Your Majesty go to touch others. This is to make the royal queen? It is reasonable for Your Majesty to hate him. Such a ignorant person. How can you think of it as the son of Xiongfu? He has only stayed in Xiongfu for a few years, and it was not Yungxiang who taught him personally, and grew up with his mother." The voice faded away. The first emperor was lenient and benevolent and advocated freedom of speech, but everyone was responsible for his speech. If there were rumors, slanders and humiliation to the royal family, he would also be punished. The matter between Yun Qingkai and Li Ying couldn't be considered private, and no one deliberately blocked the news. Of course, it was useless to block the news. Yun Qingkai still quarreled in front of the Xiongfu gate. But the matter after the abolition was sensitive, and no one dared to speak out. Yun Qingkai had anticipated all this a long time ago. His reputation was completely ruined after he was kicked out. Those who hate him vigorously promote how hateful he is. Those who love him. There is no one who loves him, so neither people deliberately prevent the spread of the news. Yun Qingsu was quietly observing his reaction. Not preventing the spread of the news was actually what Yungxiang meant, because he was going to use this incident to let Yun Qingkai clear his eyes. If Li Ying really loved him, he would not let the rumors spread. As long as Yunqing is persuaded to make him believe that Li Ying no longer takes him in his heart, the plan to persuade and leave will be half the success. Yun Qingkai's expression was faint, and he didn't seem to be moved. There was something warm on his ears. Yun Qingkai was taken aback for a moment, only to see Lin Huijin took out a pair of furry warm ears from behind and put them on his ears from behind. With warmth in his ears, Yun Qingkai subconsciously stopped to look at him. The latter smiled and said, "Look at your ears are cold and red. This was handed to me by my mother before going out. I think it's getting in the way. It's useless, I just put it on for you." The thick warm ears indeed blocked most of the voice, and a warm color flashed across Yun Qingkai's eyes. Yun Qingsu's heart jumped, and he cautiously said, "I'm afraid this is not appropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Lin Huijin looked at Yun Qingkai, and said with satisfaction, "This is not pretty." It's really good looking. Yun Qingkai is born crystal clear, plus the furry hat and warm ears, like a fine monster walking out of the mountain, very smart. It's not that it's inappropriate to wear, but Yun Qingkai is a queen in the end, and openly accepting something from another man, it's really a little out of style. Yun Qingsu looked around and made sure that no one was paying attention, then said, "Hurry up and thank Brother Linear. Anyway, Yun Qingkai also grew up with them anyway, it should be fine for my brother to take care of his younger brother." Yun Qingsu treats him like a child, but Yun Qingkai enjoys it very much. He curled his eyes and said, "Thank you Brother Linear." Behind him, Li Ying stepped up expressionlessly, but Lu Xiru hurriedly pulled the corner of his clothes. "Your Majesty, there are many people with mixed eyes." He reminded that if the Empress is making trouble here, it would be a big shame. Li Ying sullened his face, crushing the wooden stand that he was holding on, causing the stall owner to stare. Lu Xiru hurried forward to appease the compensation. "I haven't eaten anything in the morning. Are you hungry?" After a few steps, Yun Qingsu screamed, and asked his younger brother, "There is a Bingtang Suiwen shop over there. Let's sit down." Yun Qingkai stopped, tilted his head slightly, glanced obliquely behind him, and said, "Okay." The three sat down on the Suiwen stall. Yun Qingkai took the spoon handed by the fourth brother, scooped up the round and lovely Suiwen, gently blew it into his mouth, and scanned the surrounding casually. "Xiaosai, do you want to go to the ice rink later?" Lin Huijin asked, and Yun Qingsu answered on her behalf, "He still has injuries on his body, so forget it." Lin Huijin looked regretful, "I remember before, Xiao Si could slip." The first time Yun Qingkai wore ice shoes was led by Li Ying. Many of the first times in his life were brought by Li Ying. When his mother died, Yun Qingkai, who was more than 8 years old, locked himself in a suburban courtyard without seeing anyone, but Li Ying often visited him. He was the prince, and Yun Qingkai couldn't stop him. Ignore it. He built an ice wall in his heart to keep everyone outside, but no matter how cold the ice is, it can't keep someone warm all year round. Yun Qingkai finally let go of his heart and encircled him into his own territory, and divided him into equally important people with his mother. He thought he had found a new harbor for himself, but he didn't expect to let in a wicked wolf that was scheming. The corner of Yun Qingkai's eyes overflowed with sarcasm, and when he raised his face, he was gentle and harmless. "It's okay, I can, let's go together later." Yun Qingsu was taken aback, "Can you? Can your lung injury be okay?" "Well, just don't exercise vigorously." When the sword penetrated his lungs, Yun Qingkai had been unable to do very strenuous things, but the injury was actually not too serious. As long as he behaved appropriately, he would basically not recur. After eating the hot Suiwen, Yun Qingkai's face became flushed, and he came to the lake with his brother. The official game is tomorrow. There are a lot of people on the lake at this time. As long as there are ice shoes, you can join in at will. When entering, Yun Qingsu told Lin Huijin, "He has a wound on his left hand. Please pay attention, Xiao Si, if you feel uncomfortable, you have to tell me in advance, otherwise it hurts my father and takes me." "Okay." Yun Qingkai threw the big cloak to his servants, bounced twice wearing ice shoes, his eyes lit up a bit, he took the lead to jump on the ice surface, in the voice of Yun Qingsu's "Don't run around," suddenly disappeared into the crowd. In the previous life, he had revolved around Li Ying all his life, and now he was walking on the ice to control his body unscrupulously, and Yun Qingkai realized that life can also be so open and happy. He seemed to be a bird out of the cage, flexibly moving through the crowd. He was so badly slid that he was so frightened that his face was pale when he bumped into it. Someone on the ice quickly cursed, "What kind of charge? Show you how good your skills are." Yun Qingkai turned his head and glanced at him, and recognized him, Chu Yang, Chu Taiwei's fourth son. This guy walks around the flower house all the year round, blowing a leaf in a flower bush without touching his body, he can't even ice skate. Yun Qingkai raised the corner of his mouth, turned around, and came to him again, dangling deliberately. Chu Yang originally focused all his attention on his feet, and found that the other party was fluttering in white clothes, dangling in front of him frequently, and finally realized his provocation. His heart was raging, and he suddenly raised his eyes. Dare to provoke my son, do you know? I'm... Wait, who is this? Chu Yang was dumb for a moment, and finally replaced the other party's bright and enchanting face with the brows and eyebrows that were always indifferent and ridiculous in memory, and his tongue trembled. Yun. Idiot! Yun Qingkai arrogantly raised his chin and ridiculed him as the wind drifted away again. Chu Yang, you stop me! Yun Qingsu finally followed him, and smiled when he saw it. Master Chu, are you okay? Do you want me to find someone to take you? Does your brother have a brain problem? Chu Yang didn't dare to call Yun Qingkai's name directly, and pointed directly at Yun Qingsu's nose and cursed, I can't skating to provoke him. Yun Qingsu was surprised, did he bully you? Chu Yang was wronged and exploded, otherwise. Yun Qingkai has always regarded Li Ying's affairs as the biggest in the world. Now that he has not seen Li Ying for 2 days, he is still in the mood to bully others? Yun Qingsu clapped his hands happily, great! Chu Yang! You all have brain problems in the Yun family, right? Lin Huijin has been paying attention to Yun Qingkai's movements, but maybe because there are too many people on the court, or Yun Qingkai is too excited, the figure disappears from time to time when back and forth, and when they meet again with Yun Qingsu, both of them it was discovered that Yun Qingkai had disappeared. Yun Qing's words were positive and refreshing, and people who were as skilled as him quickly caught up with him. The skating rink boys were in groups, moving like flying eagles. Suddenly someone was quicker, slanting into the field like lightning. Yun Qingkai's waist tightened, and the wind whistling in his ears. When he recovered, he was picked up by his waist. Yun Qingkai was robbed. The person who hijacked him came to the shore steadily and quickly. This is a pavilion in the southwest corner of Kanglin Lake, with windproof curtains hung on all sides, and there is a charcoal basin and soft couch in it. The noise is on the opposite side, and the lakeside is guarded, and no one is allowed to approach it. Li Ying put him on a stone bench covered with soft cushions in the pavilion, then squatted in front of him and took off his ice shoes. The long hair slipped from his shoulders, resting on Yun Qingkai's calves. He held Yun Qingkai's feet in a quilted foot bag, was silent for a moment, and then raised his face. It is still the most familiar appearance in Yun Qingkai's memory, as if it is long according to his aesthetics. The complexion is white porcelain, the eyes are very dark and deep. When he puts on that dragon robe and Myankai, he will become majestic and elegant, with ancient charm, awe-inspiring and yearning. Like the wine hidden deep in the alley, Yun Qingkai is a wine drinker who follows the taste. The smell of wine hooks him forward, but he can't find a specific location. He always feels that Li Ying has 10,000 layers of black, and he digs it layer by layer, and may not be able to dig it out in his whole life, so he can only groping and being dragged, and he can never stop and approach his footsteps. Now that I think about it, maybe it is because he has given too little response, a little bit of sweetness, he has to work hard to exchange it. Li Ying raised his hand and took off the warm ears on both sides of his head. 4 eyes face each other. Li Ying spoke first, nothing to tell me. Yun Qingkai touched his ears, and said, cold. Li Ying then covered his ears, his palms were wide, because he had just been chasing the clouds on the ice rink. The temperature was very high, and it was very warm on the ears. Yun Qing's remarks revealed doubts. Lu Xiru soon sent new warm ears, and Li Ying personally put them on him, and said, it just passed. Yun Qingkai did not speak, and Li Ying asked again, is it warmer than Lin Huijin? He stared at Yun Qingkai, eager to hear unreserved approval from him. The things Ying gave were naturally better than others. These are the sweet words that Yun Qingkai often talks about. Very good. Yun Qingkai said. Lu Xiru brought new shoes, and Li Ying took them and continued to wear them to Yun Qingkai, saying, "The shoes have also been ridiculous." Yet, Yun Qingkai felt it. Yun Qingkai didn't praise him, but just let him show his favor, not accepting it or not accepting it. Li Ying's eyes appeared to laugh at himself. What I give is only worth an When did he account for these? Yun Qing raised his eyebrows slightly, and then smiled quickly. What your majesty gave is naturally very good. He stood up respectfully. Your majesty, thank you for your kindness. Li Ying pressed him down. Yun Qingkai's shoulder was held by him, and he listened to him in a deep voice. You know what I want to hear. Yun Qingkai showed a more confused expression. What do you want to hear? If you ask him to say it, he naturally can't say it. The dignity of the king of a country is greater than anything else, and his pride does not allow him to beg from anyone. What's more, those words used to be like cow dung in his eyes, making people unable to swallow. Yun Qingkai looked at him, and Li Ying was also observing him. They didn't understand why the other party would make all kinds of unreasonable actions. Why the two people who are most familiar can no longer predict each other's behavior. In the past, Yun Qingkai always liked to say something worthless, at least at that time, everyone felt that way. As long as Empress Yun saw Her Majesty, her mouth seemed to be smeared with honey, and it was clearly shuddering, but when she returned to Li Ying, she immediately became like the water in Spring Lake, a soft mess. Once, his gentle, obedient and continuous affection would be conveyed to Li Ying unabashedly, as if he was afraid that he didn't know that he loved him, didn't know that he was special in his heart and only to Li Ying. But now, his various reactions are like kicking Li Ying out of that position, clearly still in that docile appearance, but with an alienation that is thousands of miles away. The wide black cuffs were raised, and Li Ying slowly approached his hand on his knees. Yun Qingkai suddenly raised his hand and pushed the warm ears on the side of his face, seeming to be unintentional or intentional, avoiding his contact. Fingertips curled up, Li Ying gathered his eyebrows, and said, "Let me see your injury." This reason allows him to openly pull Yun Qingkai's hand, but the latter directly put his hands behind his back. He lowered his eyelashes and whispered, "Your Majesty is concerned, everything is fine with the minister." Work. Li Ying squatted in front of him, put his fingers on a stone table, and looked at him from the bottom up. "Who am I? When did you want to share with me like this?" Li Ying was once the most important person in his heart. He was once a man he regarded as a treasure, and he was the husband he thought would be with him throughout his life. But it was only once. Yun Qingkai's eyelashes flickered, and his lips pressed lightly. He is wronged. Li Ying's heart stabbed, and he stood up, breathing heavily. Yun Qingkai remembered that he had this problem, and when he was angry but couldn't vent it, he would walk around the room, and the waiter would fall on the ground and tremble, waiting until he thought of a solution, or swiped his sleeves and overturned the screen. The table case let out the anger. This stinky problem occurred soon after he became throne. He was 13 years old. Many veterans thought he was young and used seniority to pressure him. This has always been Li Ying's heart disease. The time Yun knelt down quite a year, to him, was no different from oppression. Yun Qingkai sat there and didn't move. He thought that Li Ying could be seen through in the first life of the rejuvenation, but it was a pity that he still couldn't. He had already followed him and didn't provoke him, but Li Ying was angry again because of his relationship with him. Isn't this what he always expected? Suddenly there was a shadow from top to bottom. Yun Qingkai subconsciously raised his face, the man's tall figure bends down, his arm was resting on the stone table behind him, his breath almost sprayed on his face, and then he stretched out his hand and pushed Yun Qing away. Seize hat brim, his eyes fell on the scar. Yun Qingkai's shoulders retracted, and the brim of his hat was lifted and covered. The injury on his forehead is not serious. It has scabs at this moment, but it is still a little abrupt on the porcelain white forehead. Li Ying looked at him for a moment, moved the wooden stool by himself, sat down beside him, and took out a shallow vial from his sleeve, and said, "This is the holy medicine for healing from the South Xinjiang. May I apply some for you? There is medicine in the minister's house, although it is not as good as your majesty's, but it is more than enough to cure this small injury. Where are your hands? The silly things that Chen himself did, he can take care of himself." Li Ying held the medicine, was silent for a while, and said, "This time, I wronged you. It is inevitable that you are angry. How come?" Yunqing said sincerely, "This matter is all my fault. Your Majesty didn't directly pull me out and cut me off. It is already a great grace." Li Ying stared at him silently, trying to see from his face that the other party was just making a tantrum. But he knew Yunqing's resignation too well. His calm and sincere eyebrows made it difficult for Li Ying to deceive himself. He was just playing tricks. "Your Majesty." Yun Qingkai spoke again, saying, "Fourth brother is still waiting for me on the ice rink. If I have been missing for too long, I am afraid he will be anxious." Li Ying bends his lips, jokingly and sarcastically, "And your brother Lin, hui?" Yun Qingkai was a little surprised. Just now he felt that someone was following him. It was actually Li Ying's person. He solemnly said, "Yes, brother Lin is also here." The frivolous smile shattered, and Li Ying suddenly felt that his 5 fingers were numb and stiff. He opened it restrainedly, and then slowly closed it. He looked at the pair of furry warm ears on the table, and said, "The thing brother Lin gave, do you want to put it on again?" Yunqing thought for a moment, then took off Li Ying's ears, and said, "Then return this to your Majesty." Li Ying started staring at him again. Yun Qingkai reached out for Lin Huijian's pair of warm ears, but one hand stretched out, and with a light wave, the 2 warm ears fell into the charcoal basin next to the couch without any errors. "Stand up! Yun Qingkai. This is Princess Yan Zhao, who sewed it to Master Xiaohe herself. I will explain to him myself." Ro. Yunqing resigned, "If your Majesty has nothing else to do, I will go back first." He got up and left, but Li Ying suddenly got up and stopped in front of him. He was tall, and Yunqing took a step back. Fang felt that the sense of oppression was slightly relieved. He was already a little angry. Li Ying burned Lin Huijian's ears. Even if it was all Li Ying's fault, he was also responsible for improper care. "Emperor dog," he cursed secretly in his heart, still unable to spot the slightest mistake on his face, and said, "What else is your Majesty?" Li Ying looked at him, peeped a hint of annoyance from his frowning eyebrows, and lowered his voice, "I really didn't think about sending you back to Xiangfu this time. I have heard rumors that you don't be too much care." Yun Qingkai's confusion was about to overflow. He raised his face in confusion, and almost directly posted "I can't understand you" on his forehead. "Your Majesty, when will you care about this? I just want to tell you that I will take care of this as soon as possible, Li Ying's throat rolled, staring at him, and said, "I care about you." Standing outside the pavilion, Lu Xiru tremblingly copied his hands into his sleeves, and couldn't help showing a smile. "Your Majesty is rarely subdued and shows her sincerity. The Empress must be flattered at this moment. No surprises, she should go back to the palace with your Majesty today. He can finally sleep peacefully." 2 figures suddenly slid on the ice rink ahead. Lu Xiru could see clearly, approached the curtain, and cautiously said, "Your Majesty, the 4th young Master Yun is here." Inside the pavilion, it is warm like spring. Yun Qingkai never spoke. Li Ying avoided the sight, walked over and picked up the warm ears he had brought, put it on Yun Qingkai's ears again, and said, "If you still want to go to the ice rink, I will accompany you." Yun Qingkai found the voice and said, "No need." Li Ying's gentle face was slightly frozen. "Thank you for your Majesty for caring, and the minister is grateful." Yun Qingkai continued, "Since the 4th brother has found him, I will go back first." He rubbed shoulders with Li Ying, lifted the ice shoe throne on one side, lifted the curtain and walked out. A cold wind blew on the white ice rink, and Yun Qingsu and Lin Huijin were looking towards the frozen lake. Yun Qingkai shook his head and ran quickly to put on ice shoes, and said, "Your Majesty just asked me for something, are you waiting in a hurry?" Lin Huijin's eyes fell on his ears, and said, "No hurry." Yun Qingsu was a little unhappy. "What did your Majesty say to you?" "Nothing." Yun Qing resigned. "Shall we slide back from here, change our shoes and go to Jinya building to eat?" Lin Huijin said, "It's a coincidence, I've set a position before I come, and your third brother should be there too." "Really?" Yun Qingkai's eyes lit up and said, "He went out early and returned late. I haven't seen him in the past few days." "Let's go." Yun Qingsu supported him while he was on the ice, and the three of them got together and quickly slid to the other side. The curtain was lifted again, and it was obvious that he came out of the warm pavilion, but Li Ying's body was colder than the ice and snow outside. Lu Xiru just stared at the pendant and mysterious boots on his waist, not daring to explore his expression. Li Ying stepped to the lakeside, bent over to pick up the exquisite embroidered cotton boots on the ground, and then looked at the ice for a long time until Yun Qingkai was no longer found. He said, "Lu Xiru." Lu Xiru hurried forward, "What's your command?" "When the queen returns to the door, what equipment should I have?" This, when the Yasukuni dynasty was founded, the queen was equipped with a Fengjil Yuan driver for the first time, a 20-passenger car, a pair of red, blue, and white umbrellas, 18 auspicious figure fans, a guard of honor totaling about 80 people, and 304 guards. A sweaty horse opens the way, and then returns to the door. It will not be so solemn. "What about me?" Your Majesty usually goes out of the palace, the figure fan adds 30, the honor guard has to increase to 100 people, the has more than 1,000, and the car is 30 passengers. The driver and the are determined according to the size of the trip, but at least the generals above the captain. Armored soldiers, archers, cavalry, etc. formed 4 guard phalanxes and front and rear guards. Lu Xiru uttered endlessly, and took a sigh of relief. "With the equipment I used to travel and drive, I will pick up the emperor and return to the palace." Lu Xiru stood by the lake in a mess. The emperor's travel is divided into big, dharma, and small driving. Lu Xiru just talked about the most basic small driving equipment. The emperor's return to the door is not a major event. If it is related to the emperor's driving, it would be unprecedented. He hurriedly followed, "Your Majesty, the minister knows that Your Majesty loves the emperor and is criticized by others, but this method is to find 2 generals to open the way personally. Is it a bit too exaggerated just to pick up the emperor and return to the palace? I will go personally." "Lu Xiru, this preparation may take some time. Give you 7 days. What else Lu Xiru wanted to say, the emperor had already got in the car directly, so he could only shut up. Another voice came from the car, "Keep it from the Yun family." Lu Xiru realized that he wanted to surprise the queen. "I just don't know, for Yun Xiang, the emperor's high-profile admiration is a surprise or a fright." In this case, Yun Qingkai and his elder brother came to the lake together. He sat on the low stool handed by the next person, and changed his ice shoes with his eyes down. Lin Huijin next to him, together with him, whispered softly, "Is my ears warm?" "Yet." Yun Qingkai whispered, "I accidentally fell into the brazier and burned." Then he said, "I'm sorry." Although it was Li Ying Shou, he really could not shirk the blame. Lin Huijin sighed and said soothingly, "You don't have to blame yourself, and it's not that expensive." He handed the ice shoe to the servant and helped Yun Qingkai up easily. Yun Qingsu came over and noticed that Yun Qingkai's expression was wrong, and said, "What's the matter?" "I accidentally burned Master Xiaohe's warm ears." "It's not his fault." Lin Huijin said. Yun Qingsu raised his eyebrows, and realized that Li Ying, the dog emperor, is not good at hurting people, but the vinegar is quite fresh. He touched the younger brother's head and said with relief, "Okay, go back and let Aunt Ding sew one for him. Lin Huijin laughed, it won't get in the way. Yun Qingkai still bowed his head until he got into the carriage. Yun Qingsu thought that he was still blaming himself, and while feeling that Yun Qingkai also had a conscience, he said, "You don't do well in needlework. If you really feel uncomfortable, let's sew one for Master Xiaohe." He was really good at sewing. He took care of Li Ying's life in his previous life. Yun Qingkai would make him at least a new set of clothes and a pair of shoes every year. This is not difficult for him. But in the end it was her mother who did it. Yun Qingkai values her mother very much. He saves others with oneself and naturally feels that the things Princess Yanzhao sews by herself are irreplaceable. I'm afraid the other party will not accept it easily. Lin Huijin suddenly opened his mind and looked at him eagerly, with a look of expectation. Can you? The author has something to say. Li Huang, reject him cize, Under consideration JPG. Li Ying is busy with government affairs, and Lin Huijin may not really be able to get an explanation from him. This is why Yun Qingkai feels angry. Li Ying will never be responsible for Lin Huijin's warm ears, so if the warm ears are burned, he can only take care of the aftermath by directly contacting Lin Huijin. The Dog Emperor. It will only cause him trouble. How come I haven't found Li Ying so unflattering before? He nodded, and said, if Xiaohe doesn't dislike it. Lin Huijin's eyes curled up and said meaningfully, I can't ask for it. Jinialu is the best restaurant in Shangyang City. It is used to receive some dignitaries. If you want to eat here, there is not enough money. You must have official ranks or know people in this area. Yun Qingsu and others should often have dinner here. As soon as they entered, they were led to the second floor elegant seat by Xiao Er. The three of them sat down here. Yun Qingsu poured a glass of water for Yun Qingkai, and Lin Huijin said, new customer, give me a dish. Hey! The little second didn't ask who he was, and immediately chanted, here we have long feng cheng xiang consensus pancakes, anchovy shark fins, red plum beads, fragrant beans, noodles, and gratin horns. Fried frog with coriander, fried pigeon, and 8 treasures wild duck bergamot rolls, golden crispy finch rouille golden roll with cuttlefish shreds, you can swim in the flying river in the sky. Which one do you like to eat? Yun Qingkai's eyes brightened to him, but he also came to Jinialu to eat a few times, but they were all before entering the palace. He had been married to Li Ying for 4 years, and his status was honorable and inconvenient to accompany him. Yun Qingkai, you are not allowed to go out of the palace without permission, so the food and drink in Shangyang City sounds very fresh now. He ordered a few that sounded good, and Yun Qingsu said, we are only 4 of us today. If we order too much, we can't finish it. You pick what you want, we won't order it, and we will bring you next time we want to eat. Come. Okay. Although the Yun family is noble, Yun Xiang doesn't like to waste, and Li Ying is not a luxury person. Therefore, Yun Qingkai left the imperial dining room to arrange in the palace. At this moment, he didn't feel wrong. I picked a few more, a total of 8 dishes and 1 soup, and Xiao Er quickly wrote them down and arranged them. The curtain of the lounge was half dangling, and someone stepped up the stairs. Chu Yang said angrily, you don't know how arrogant he is. And that Yun Qingsu, who relied on his own family to have a queen, can ruin his arrogance. His arrogance and domineering didn't just start today. If he were not too arrogant, how could he end up like this? Someone comforted him, you also calm down. Why don't I let me down? What a great man, he is so rampant when he is a phoenix on ice, why didn't he bury him in the falling ice today? You can't talk nonsense about this. Ning Yi, can your 3 sisters work? The madman has been driven out now, but you have asked her to work harder. I will wait for the day after the new canonization, go to the Yun family to see him go crazy. Ning Yi sighed, don't be so loud. What's wrong with me loudly? It's not on the ice. I can't run away if I see him again. If I don't beat him up and cry, I will give him the surname Yun. Can your father agree? Chu Yang stopped abruptly, and the curtain of one elegant room was lifted. Yun Qingkai inside was wearing a hat, with a straight posture, and his tone was not hurried. Why? I beat my father and my mother crying. Chu Yang was silent for a moment and said, Who said he beat you? I'm talking about Yun Qingsu. He stared at Yun Qingsu, who was holding the curtain on one side. The latter raised his eyebrows and said, Me. Chu Yang was vicious, you. In that case, Yun Qing said, Fourth brother, you accompany him out to practice. Yun Qingsu politely moved his muscles and bones, and the joints creaked. Chu Yang immediately took a step back, and pulled out the people behind him, frowned and said, You go. It was Ning Yi, the son of Ning Shangshu, who was pushed up. He secretly cursed in his heart that your father and Yun Xiang were so hot all day long. Does he know that you are so afraid of the son of the Yun family? At any rate, he was also the son of Tai Wei, so he was hiding behind him, wanting to be shameless. He respectfully said, after seeing Jun Yun, the fourth son of Yun, Lord Lin Ziahe. Look, all of them are higher than him. Does Chu Yang have a brain to push him out to block guns? President Ning. Yun Qingsu and Lin Huijin responded, and Ning Yi bit the bullet and said, Let's go there first. Chu Yang shrank behind Ning Yi and said nothing. He heard his father and elder brother mention Yun Qingkai at home, and every time they mentioned him, they showed unabashed contempt. The whole Shangyang had never seen anything so virtuous. If Yun Qingkai didn't chase Li Yingrun, casually looking for a position or a half at the top, is also smart enough to survive. In the beginning, Chu Yang also despised Yun Qingkai, until he began to hear about Yun Qingkai's murder from his father and brother. His cruel and jealous image was known to everyone in the palace. Chu Yang's aunt is the imperial concubine. When he came to visit the palace, he saw Yun Qingkai, wrapped in a mink cape, sitting on a high position with no expression on his face, tasting the fine spring tea. The beaten flesh and blood minion. He was reminded by the palace man and stood aside and held his breath. Soon, the minion lost his breath and was dragged away. Yun Qingkai came to him, and said lightly, Hold up your head. Chu Yang looked at him with a pale face. Yun Qing was very good, but people who watched him at that time could hardly notice how good-looking he was, and would only remember his shameful and stern eyebrows. Good-looking. He watched the young man who was not as tall as he stretched out his fingers and raised his chin, is also here to see your majesty. Chu Yang. He thought Chu Yang was the male favorite sent in. After learning that he was the son of Tai Wei, Yun Qingkai laughed, but the murderous intent in his eyes came like a poisonous mist, almost burning his skin. Prince Chu has always looked down on this palace, why is it now? Come up with this idea. Chu Yang had to explain himself, I just came to see my aunt. Oh! The murderous intent dissipated in an instant. Yun Qingkai took away his fingers and wiped the white fingertips. He didn't say sorry, didn't say a word of nonsense, and put his shoulder on the ground without looking back. Chu Yang was frightened by him, his legs were weak, and he wobbled all the way, looking in a trance. At that time, he understood that Yun Qingkai didn't care about people or things that had nothing to do with Li Ying. However, the unabashed viciousness that Yun Qingkai exuded at the time still scared him and did not sleep well for a few days. What he said just now, Yun Qingkai must be remembered in his heart. He hates the most because someone cursed him for being abandoned by Li Yingziu. Chu Yang had heard that Yungziang would clean up after he got married because he missed him. The small courtyard where he lives is what a touching love between father and son. But Yun Qingkai didn't appreciate it at all. He ridiculed Yungziang, I have been so clean, so I hope I will be driven back by Li Ying as soon as possible. Yun Qingkai is such a terrible guy, he will never let them go easily. I'm afraid that if you are going to call Dad here today, you may be scolded by pointing your nose, but that is better than being killed by Yun Qingkai. Ning Yi had also heard of Yun Qingkai's life, and he waited nervously. Yun King Su said casually, "Go." Ning Yi and Chu Yang didn't move, obviously they didn't find his words useful. Yun King Kai poured himself a glass of water, and realized that several people were looking at him. After a reaction, he said to the people outside the door, "Why, the two of you still want to have a meal with me?" Chu Yang straightened his waist first, and quickly got into his private room. Ning Yi is a bit more stable than him, forcing his composure. In the room, the two people were lying on the table together. Chu Yang first showed a weird expression. Has he been divorced? Not like. Chu Yang furrowed his brows and said, "Is there a chance after the abolition?" Ning Yi's heart jumped. If Yun King Kai is abolished, then his third sister may be canonized as a queen, but if Yun King Kai's things take a turn, then there is a cloud, and the third sister will not be a queen in this life. Ning Yi hesitated for a while, and said, "Fourth young master thinks, is there anything we can fix this matter as soon as possible? Unless he goes crazy again." Chu Yang touched his chin and said, "Or the cloud will fall." It sounds difficult. Ning Yi said, "I think the top priority is to figure out why he is suddenly not crazy. Maybe my brain suddenly improved." Chu Yang pinched a peanut, and said, "He never cared about anyone other than your majesty." He suddenly thought of the young man who took the initiative to provoke him in the morning, bright, like a phoenix on ice, as if he had been quietly reborn in nirvana when he was unknown. Chu Yang accidentally bit his finger. In Ning Yi's surprised gaze, his brain was empty. "I'm not going crazy for your majesty now, is it because he has someone else crazy for him?" Ning Yi. It is very possible that as long as he is no longer entangled, Xiongfu should take the initiative to propose peace. Your majesty is sick of him and disgusts him, and will never refuse. That. Then my third sister. Ning Yi's eyes flashed a light. There is a chance. Because of Yun King Kai's desire to control, the emperor has never been lucky enough to have any other concubines. If Yun King Kai let go, he would be completely free. The concubines in the palace, regardless of their family background, count his third sister except Yun Qing's resignation. If she becomes a queen, he is the uncle of the country. Chu Yang blushed and whispered, "It's a pity, the other person who was madly entangled by him must be miserable." That's not necessarily true. After drinking some wine, Ning Yi felt a little fluttered, and said, "Although Yun King Kai's personality is not very good, his appearance is still very good. If he can catch up, I don't mind. Seeing that they are so greedy, it must be more vigorous than the girl in the flower house." Then what? Then what to do? Who dares to pick up the things that your majesty has thrown away? What's the matter? Chu Yang frowned, muttering a little displeased, "If you can marry and put it at home, the townhouse would be great. It's estimated that I'll be off first, hey?" On Yun King Kai's side, after the food came, someone suddenly came to report that Yun King Ju had something to do, and she would not come to eat together. He also said in particular, "I am really sorry that the deputy commander asked the queen to bring a message to disturb your yaxing. This is a bit too polite." Yun King Su dismissed the person first and resigned to Yun Qing, "The third brother is not sociable, don't take it to your heart." "I know." Yun King Kai lowered his head, picked up the rice grains in the bowl, and groaned, "It's all a family, you don't need to explain to me." Yun King Su looked embarrassed, and then touched his head with a touched expression on his face. Yun King Kai obediently accepted it, and Lin Huijin couldn't help but said, "I saw you this time, it really changed a lot. Then am I better or worse?" Yun King Kai said casually, turning his face to look at him, but Lin Huijin was caught off guard and asked. She was taken aback for a moment before earnestly saying, "It's getting better." Yun King Kai curled his eyes and happily took a few mouthfuls of rice. After the meal, Yun King Kai went out with his fourth brother. Before getting into the car, Lin Huijin reminded him, "Don't forget my warm ears." Yet. Yun Qing resigned, "I'll send you to the mansion when the time comes." No, I will pick it up personally then. Yun Qingkai briskly agreed. He didn't like to press things with his hands. It was rare to heal and relax these few days, and there was no need to run for Li Ying. After returning home, he found 2 pieces of leather and sat in front of the window and sewed them together. The sky darkened, and snow fell outside the window. During Yun Qing's resignation, he went to dine with his family, soaked in the soup, and came back with half-dry long hair. Jin Huan had already lit the lamp. Empress, it's time to go to bed and rest. I have finished sewing these 2 stitches, you go first. He sat down in front of the lamp, his face was outlined with a soft light. Jin Huan and Yingxi were clearly aware that he was different from before. Kind is not like Yun Qingkai. The 2 attendants stood still, until Yun Qingkai raised his eyes and urged again, I will go to bed soon, and I don't need to wait, go and rest. Only then did the 2 retreat respectfully. Yun Qingkai was the only one left in the house. He sews the last stitch, cuts it with scissors, checked the tie, and then was taken aback. The other. A familiar breath came from behind. Yun Qingkai frowned while pinching a warm ear that had just been sewn. Careless. Having been with Li Ying for too long, I was already so familiar with him that I couldn't be more familiar, and I didn't even know when he sneaked into his room. There was a shadow in front of the lamp, and someone bent over from behind him, encircling his slender waist. Yun Qingkai straightened his spine, his thin shirt outlined the shape of his shoulder blades, and the man's sleek chin pressed up. Li Ying stretched out his hand directly in front of him, opened his palm, and whispered, looking for this. Yun Qingkai nodded, stretched out his hand to take it, but a chuckle came from his ear. Li Ying grabbed both warm ears, bent over and picked him up. Yun Qingkai subconsciously grabbed the corner of his clothes. Li Ying hugged him into the screen, then put him on the couch, looked at his bewildered face, raised the warm ears in his hands, and said, the injury is still not healed, so what do you need to sew it? It was his familiar voice, but the rare gentleness. Yun Qing replied, when did you come? When you were in the bath. Shameless. Li Ying didn't feel how shameless he was at all. When he noticed Yun Qingkai stared at him, he stretched out his hand and scratched his nose. Yun Qing retreated, and Li Ying couldn't help but laugh, and said, do you want to hide from me? Is there anything, your majesty? Li Ying leaned towards him. Yun Qingkai leaned back against the head of the bed, unable to hide any more, so he stretched out his hand to push. What do you do when you come here so late? Before he could figure out Li Ying's purpose, Yun Qingkai didn't want to involve him too much. He has been staying at home for this period of time, and the situation in the palace is unknown. It seems that he needs to find an opportunity to contact the eyeliner as soon as possible to confirm whether there is any emergency recently. Li Ying kept a good distance from him obediently, still very gentle, I'll see you and see if you, are you sleeping well? You are free. Yun Qing resigned, I've seen enough, let's go back. I'll go back when you sleep. Yun Qingkai had to lie down and said, I'm asleep. Close your eyes. Yun Qingkai closed his eyes and opened them suddenly. Li Ying's face was close at hand. He couldn't get a kiss and was discovered. He looked a little uncomfortable. He paused for a while and said, this, I like it very much. Li Ying's Adam's apple rolled, resisting the urge to hug him, and pressed the tip of his tongue, seemingly embarrassed, you, help me put it on. He thought that these warm ears were sewn for him. The author has something to say, cize, this. Li Huang. The snow is like crumbs, small and dense, and there is no variegated color in the yard. Because I just used my eyes, the lights in the house were very bright, but when the screen was blocked, the light on the side of the bed was still a little dim. Yun Qingkai leaned on the pillow, his long hair with splashed ink was held by a ebony wooden hairpin. Li Ying leaned slightly and sat in front of him, his hair slipped a few strands from his shoulders, and his eyes were glowing. In his previous life, Yun Qing had been used to his resignation for 12 years. Even in this life, he had been used to resigning by Yunqing for 4 years. It is not surprising that he would have such a thought. If it was Yunqing's resignation, he would definitely put the warm ears on him without hesitation, and could not sleep happily all night because Li Ying took the initiative to ask for a gift from him. Don't talk about Lord Lin Ziahe, the heavenly king Lao Tzu has to be behind Li Ying when he comes. Yun Qingkai smirked, wondering whether it was for the self who drove in the past, or for Li Ying, who is now self-satisfied. This is not for your majesty. He took back the warm ears from Li Ying's hand, stretched it out, and said, it's for Master Ziahe. Li Ying's expression froze, and the light in his eyes shrank rapidly. Did you sew and warm his ears with your own hands? Yes. Yun Qingkai's expression was open and serious, and Li Ying looked at him for a few breaths. Why? He kindly warmed my ears to keep my ears warm, but I lost it due to improper care, so I should return him. Good intentions. Anger was surging in his chest, and Li Ying felt ridiculous. Is it kind or ulterior? It is true that I have ulterior motives. Yunqing replied, rumors abound. Although he just gave me a pair of warm ears, he still protects me from bad words. I should cherish such good care and dedication. Li Ying's lips trembled. Treasure. Yun Qingkai just looked at him. Li Ying said every word, as if to make sure he could hear clearly. Do you know what you said? You Yun Qingdi, as a queen, should you cherish another man's mind? As for a man, as for a woman, if he treats me well, I treat him well. Do you know how to avoid suspicion? Li Ying said restrainedly, Lin Huijin is the son of my aunt. I know. He likes you. Yun Qingkai was startled slightly and said, oh. Oh? Li Ying had a sullen face, staring at Yun Qingkai for a moment, and said bitterly, I don't allow you to give it to him. I have promised him. I don't allow it. Li Ying said, I have promised, but I won't be allowed to give it. This is an order. Yunqing thought a little bit, and said, then, if your majesty likes it, take it away. Li Ying was spoiled. Yunqing's death in his previous life had spent too much effort on him, and he didn't want to quarrel with him anymore. Anyway, no one of them could convince anyone, so it's better to be like this. He is his king, he after being his, respect each other like a guest. The white palm lies in front of him. The grey warm ears are furry and look very warm. This warmth should belong to him. Li Ying moved his fingers, but didn't take it away directly. Instead, he raised his eyes and asked Yun Qingkai, where is Lin Huijin? He was eager to say Yun Qingkai, let someone sew a pair for him, or, your majesty didn't mean to explain to him, I didn't care. Yun Qingkai said, I will sew another pair for him. Li Ying was jealous, you must give it to him. Your majesty. Yun Qingkai had to remind him, it was you who broke his things. I am helping you with the aftermath, and I have promised him. People can't say nothing. This matter doesn't require you to come forward. Where is your majesty? Yunqing resigned. Why didn't your majesty tell him the first time when Lin Huijin was by the lake, you burned his warm ears? Why did you let me go back to face him? Why did you can you return to the palace with such peace of mind? Your hand is still injured. Your majesty. Yun Qingkai became impatient, why bother, you and me don't have to be so arrogant. My injury is the price I paid for my stupidity. The whole Shangyang city knows that, your majesty doesn't need to remind me again and again. Yun Qingkai said that he was hypocritical and felt that he was deliberately humiliating. Li Ying's fingertips contracted and his heart was dull, so he had to calm down and explain, I'm just caring about you. When I learned that I warmed Lin Huijin's ears, I cared. Then you came when I was bathing. I sewed an extra warm ear under the lamp. For so long, you thought I was doing it for you. Here, why didn't you think of caring? I am not, you came when you were in the shower. Yunqing lied to him unexpectedly, then when did you come? When you are almost ready. Li Ying pursed his lips. Unexpectedly he would lift a rock and hit himself in the foot. Not long after I come, you will cut the thread. Yun Qingkai expressionlessly said, then in this short period of time, haven't you been chuckles? Your first reaction at that time was to let me put it on for you, why didn't you think of caring about me? He slowly said, your skill in disguising affectionateness is not as good as before. Li Ying looked at him suddenly. His hair was pitch black, his eyelashes were pitch black, his eyes were pitch black, and the abyss was unpredictable, so he set off the extra whiteness of his face, as if he had been drained of blood, it was horribly white. Yun Qingkai didn't like this. Now that he has been born again, everything starts again, his father and his brother are there, and the right way is to build a good relationship with Li Ying and make the Yun family stand more stable. He doesn't want to continue entanglement, just want to be respectful with him and maintain the best cooperative relationship. In his previous life, he founded the youth division as Li Ying to supervise the officials. It was a force that made people fearful, and it was also a force that allowed Li Ying to sit back and relax as a powerful emperor. Although later he completely handed over AOSI under Li Ying's coax, he didn't leave half of his whole cards in his hand. But now the youth secretary is still in his hands, and the leader youth secretary only recognizes him. In other words, a lot of information that Li Ying obtains every month is in his hands. Li Ying only has the great cause of the emperor in his heart. He has already wanted to open up and will not continue to entangle himself. Then in this life, he may get what he needs from each other, and he will control the mountains and rivers. If he couldn't be pacified, he killed him. However, Li Ying's tight press today still made him lose his sense. Shouldn't let those shameless scheming methods insult this clean and pure interest relationship. After 1,000 threads, Yunqing opened his lips and said, Chen means. I know. What? Do you know? You're just so angry that you don't know what to say. This also saved him from bothering to find a reason. Yun Qingkai nodded and said, yes. Warm your ears, Li Ying's voice was slightly hoarse, just rely on you and pay him. This is the Li Ying he is familiar with. He shouldn't put this little matter in his eyes, let alone waste his tongue and argue with him here. Yun Qingkai put the warm ears away and said, okay. He took away the acrimony and meanness graciously, and became well-behaved and pleasant. It's not that Yun Qingkai had never been mean in front of Li Ying, but it was all because Li Ying defended others. He was angry and jealous. Yun Qingkai had never defended anyone in front of him, let alone someone who had a good impression of him. Man! Yun Qingkai shouldn't care about those people, he should only care about Li Ying. But now, Yun Qingkai mocked him, pretending to be affectionate. Yun Qingkai lay down, with long black hair spread out on the pillow, his delicate face was like beads and jade, his eyes soft, Your Majesty. Reason reminded Li Ying that it was time to leave, but when he heard him shout, he couldn't help but want to approach, he was slightly in a daze. Hey! It's late at night. Yunqing resigned from the guest order, go back and rest earlier. He has no plans to keep him. Li Ying's jaw tightened, and he tucked the quilt in silence. Yun Qingkai followed his hands and said, don't bother, I will take care of myself. Li Ying said, okay. He stood up, reached out and put down the bedclothes for him, looking as if he was reluctant to give up. Yun Qingkai's eyes became confused again. Li Ying's footsteps were far away. Before leaving, he thoughtfully helped him turn off the light. Yun Qingkai thought about how to get in touch with the palace eyeliner as soon as possible, and fell asleep in a deep sleep. I don't know how long it took, a hand that was as Kang Zaihuzo lifted the heavy bed curtain, and that hand kept this movement quietly for a long time before finally withdrawing it. They were so familiar that they had almost carved each other into their bones, just like Li Ying was unsuspectingly pierced into the arm by him with a silver needle in the menu pavilion, and Yun Qingkai didn't even notice his approach. The snowy night is long and people tend to fall asleep very heavily. Lu Xiru is suddenly half-wake and half-dreaming. There is no one standing in the lighted house. The hair all over his body stood up. Lu Xiru suddenly leaned under the pillow, and Huach Hiza lighted up. His Majesty. He recognized the other party. Li Ying stood silently, his figure darker than the dark night, and his aura deeper than the abyss, as if there were endless dark tides wrapping him from head to toe. Lu Xiru turned over and lit the lamp, covered the lampshade. The dim light dispelled the darkness in the room, but couldn't drive away the dark tide around Li Ying. I don't know how long he stayed outside before he came. There was a layer of broken snow on his body and head, his hair was frozen, and his voice was hoarse. Within 3 days, I will take the emperor and return to the palace. 3 days. Lu Xiru didn't expect that he would come to say this in the middle of the night, and couldn't help but feel embarrassed. As usual, if you really practice the emperor's law, you have to make preparations at least 1 month in advance. 7 days are already strong, I said. Li Ying approached sharply. His face was pale, his facial features appeared strange and vicious, and the red blood vessels could be seen trembling slightly in his angered pupils. Within 3 days, return to the palace after receiving the emperor. At that moment, as if a hideous evil spirit rushed out of human skin, Lu Xiru's eyebrows jumped wildly, and he fell at the feet of the emperor with a puff. Yes, the minister must make arrangements. The interior was brightly lit, and the walls cast a long and slender shadow. The shadow was bent over and stared at the feet, with a soft tone, Mr. Hard Work. Li Ying is too moody now. Lu Xiru dare not talk about hard work, and dare not delay any longer. Early the next morning, he ran to the Taiwei's mansion. Chu Xian was practicing the whip. When Lu Xiru entered the door, he just heard the fourth son of the Taiwei's mansion sighing, "Big brother, I can't do it anymore, I really can't do it, so I will rest for a while." Chu Xian slapped his whip at his feet, and Chu Yang wailed, hurriedly straightened his arms, and steadied his horse again. Lord Chu. Chu Xian is the eldest of the Chu family and the most important child of Prince Chu. He quickly handed the whip to his servant, hurried forward, and said, "Mr. Lu. Your Majesty's orally." 2 days later, he will follow the rule of the emperor, and I hope that the leader will tie up a few teams of good players and arrange a phalanx close guard. Chu Xian looked surprised. Dare to ask if you want to drive by law, what is the important thing? It's hard to say a word. Lu Xiru sighed, if you bring the verbal order, I have to go back first. Please be sure to act appropriately. This is considered advice. Chu Xian looked solemn and said, "Thank you, Mr. for your suggestion." Lu Xiru hurriedly left. Chu Yang had already taken the opportunity to sway in front of him. "Big brother, Mr. Lu came here in person, is there something major? Is it necessary to say?" Chu Xian frowned, and said, "But if it is a serious matter, why is the preparation so anxious? That means it is very important to your Majesty, but not so important to the world." Chu Yang analyzed, suddenly clapped his hands, and said, "Do you think he is going to the Xiongfu to pick up the emperor and then return to the palace? The queen?" Chu Xian's eyes filled with mockery, "That lunatic, is he also worthy? Actually, I don't think he is so unbearable. Isn't it time to bully you on the ice?" Chu Yang straightened up slightly, and said solemnly, "Neither is he, anyone bullies him." "Hey!" Chu Xian took the whip again, and drew it at him fiercely, "Let you read more. If you don't learn and know nothing, you will forget everything when you see a good-looking face." Chu Yang grinned as he was drawn, "Just be angry, maybe your Majesty is going to take him back to the palace with a method. Your Grand Commander is just one of the pendants that your Majesty gave him." A long face. Chu Xian sneered, "Absurd, after a return to the door, even if he doesn't even have a car, if he Yun Qingkai can turn the sky, you are my elder brother." Yun Qingkai had a heavy sleep this time. When he woke up, he found a small bottle with a shallow mouth on the head of the bed with a transparent paste inside. He remembered that this was the holy healing medicine Li Ying wanted to apply to him in the pavilion. Came in the wind and snow late at night, the purpose is to deliver medicine? If he is not making any bad ideas, then he has seen a ghost. Putting on his cotton clothes, he got up and went to the table, opened the drawer, and took out a dark wooden sign pendant from it. Although it is made of wood, the tentacles are heavy and the carvings are complicated. Shou always cleans it carefully. The surface is very smooth and there is no dust in the gaps. This is Li Ying personally took the red bean wood, and the texture was also carved by his own hands. It is composed of a landscape character with moir, water, wave, star, moon, and phoenix. It is the word Ci of Yunqing Ci. Li Ying has a similar piece. It uses many elements, corresponding to the phoenix, and engraved a dragon. The landscape character composed of it is his Ying. He also clamped a magnet between the two wooden plagues. As long as they were facing each other, they would attract one place, requiring a lot of effort to separate them. When Yun Qingkai was presented to Yun Qingkai for the first time, it was a pair of wooden plagues embracing each other. At first, Yun Qingkai thought it was a hole, until Li Ying took his hand and the two separated the wooden plagues together, and then held each of them. Peace. This is a token of love given to him by Li Ying when he was newly married. Yun Qingkai was reluctant to wear it, and did not allow Li Ying to wear it often, for fear of losing it, but he would still hold it in his hand during the day to observe. Every inch of the pattern on it was deeply carved in his blood. The commander of the youth is in charge of the leader of the youth, and the highest superior is the person who holds this wooden sign, that is, Yun Qingkai. He would use the special cyan corner incense for daily contact, but he was driven out in a hurry this time, and he didn't carry it. It was obviously unrealistic to go back to the palace to get it, so he could only get this. To take some time to replace the tokens that had been connected to AOSI, he had to slowly remove Li Ying from his life. Yun Qingkai put the wooden plaque on his body while pressing the ring. On a cold day, he did not go to breakfast with his father and brother, but filled his stomach in his house. After packing up, I ran into Yun Qingsu when I went out. All right? Master Xiaohe came to pick us up to the ice rink, and you happened to be out. Today, my second brother Zimi will go together. Yun Qingkai followed him obediently and said, "Where is my father?" "Father is going to Bachhanju, there is a glaze he likes at auction today. I have already stepped on it several times before. He has to get it." Yun Qingkai also knows this little hobby of his father, but his father is going to break his heart this time, because he remembers clearly that this time Tai Weiqiu set up several obstacles on the road, such as the carriage that cannot be moved and the crying woman in the middle of the road. When he arrived, Glaze Cai had been photographed. It was not that he deliberately paid attention to the Xiongfu, but the young secretary was too dedicated. When monitoring the officials, he would gather all the relationship between the other parties' good and evil relations into intelligence to facilitate the planning of the peak. Today's AOG has not developed so terrible as later, but the net has been cast down, and growth is only a matter of time. Yun Qingkai didn't plan to tell his old father about this. The harder he was in this matter, the more satisfied he would be when he received the best glaze from him in the future. He comfortably got into the carriage with his brother, found a perfect seat in the viewing pavilion, grabbed a handful of melon seeds, and nibbled slowly. The young man on the ice rink is vigorous, and everyone can be heard shouting outside the arena. Yun Qingkai couldn't hold back, he got up and walked to the side of the handrail with his eyes wide open, admiring it with relish. The previous life was really a ghost. There are many men with long legs and handsome faces in this world, and there are no men younger than Li Ying. Why are they just hanged on a tree? Someone by his side followed, a warm object touched his hand. Yun Qingkai lowered his head and saw that it was a hand stove. Lin Huijin said, "Don't patronize, be careful of freezing." Yun Qing's resignation paused, and Li Ying was right. Lin Huijin was the son of his aunt. If he really cares about himself, he should avoid suspicion. He did not answer, but shouted Yingxi, asking him to take the warm ears that were sewed yesterday, and then handed it to Lin Huijin, "Return this to Master Xiaohe." Are you really sewing? Lin Huijin raised the corner of his mouth. When he took it, he saw the white gauze on his wrist, smiling slightly, and said, "Actually, there is no need to worry. It's okay." Yun Qingkai bends his eyes at him. In his previous life, he was too paranoid and ignored the kindness of too many people. Once again, he hopes to get along with everyone in harmony. A good reputation is also conducive to standing more stable. Lin Huijin tentatively handed out the hand stove again. Before they could speak, someone squeezed in between the two. Yun Qingxiao directly stuffed his hand stove into Yun Qingkai's hand and said, "It's windy here, go back and sit down." He always looked indifferent, as if no one cared about it, but what he said was always indisputable. Yun Qingkai obediently took it and returned to the chair. Yun Qingxiao continued to stand beside Lin Huijin and reminded, "He is still the queen." Lin Huijin clenched her hands to warm her ears, and whispered, "I know." Yun Qingxiao patted him on the shoulder and returned to Yun Qingkai again. The spectators on the pavilion are not always reserved. For example, Yun Qingsu rushed to the handrail and clenched his fists to applaud the players he was optimistic about. Chu Yang squeezed in unwillingly and yelled louder than him. Yun Qingsu glanced at him and said, "Which one are you talking about? Which one are you talking about? Wearing a red scarf? I'm talking about that too." Then the two suddenly looked pleasing to each other. After the game was over, Yun Qingkai walked out of the pavilion, facing the figure of the fourth brother and Chu Jiawan on their backs, deeply confused. "Sister-in-law." A crisp young voice came from one side. Yun Qingkai stopped, and a young man with a red scarf and a black face jumped in front of him happily. Yun Qingxiao immediately stepped forward and stopped him. Sixth. The young boy's eyes were extremely white on his black face, and Yun Qingkai finally recognized the person from his dancing and dancing, Ian. Yun Qingxiao also recognized it, Prince An. Li Ying's sixth brother, Li Yan. Did he sneak into the private ice rink? I also paint my face in this color. Yun Qingkai frowned, and Li Yan could not wait to jump over and opened the box in his hand. Although it is a private enterprise, this year's prize is not bad. It is a pair of white jade chicks. Look at my sister-in-law. He excitedly raised the trophy to Yun Qingkai. Li Yan and Li Ying were both sons. The first emperor named two queens together. The first one died in a dystocia, and the latter was the current queen mother. She gave birth on almost the same day as the former queen, but was much luckier than the former queen and gave birth to Li Ying. Was canonized as a new queen. A few years later, Li Yan and Li Fu gave birth to a pair of twins. In his previous life, Yunqing had a good relationship with Li Yan and Li Fu. When he was beaten into the cold palace, Li Yan ran to Li Ying to intercede for him, but Li Ying was cruel and dragged him out and beat him 4 times. Top 10 boards. When Yunqing resigned, he was probably still recuperating on the couch. But now that he doesn't wait to see Li Ying and the Queen Mother, it is naturally impossible to treat Li Yan as he did in his previous life. Yun Qingkai glanced lightly, and said with a smile, "It's really good, Ian is amazing." Li Yan didn't see his estrangement. He didn't hesitate to hand over his trophy and said, "Sister-in-law likes it, then give it to her sister-in-law." He hasn't left the palace to build a mansion yet. This time he sneaked out for the purpose of going to the ice rink to participate in the game, but he would definitely be found if he took the spoils back. If he found it, he would have to be punished. He is willing to get close to Yun Qingkai. Li Ying said that he was lenient and benevolent, but in fact, there was nothing good in his bones. He was unrelenting when he started to discipline his younger brother. For many years, Li Yan could be said to have no way to ask for help. Li Ying is very obedient to Yun Qingkai before marriage and even more after marriage. In the past few years, whenever Li Yan wanted to be lazy and skating, he would go to Yun Qingkai to hide, because Li Ying almost never clouded the cloud. Lost his temper before Qingkai. Even if they have been arguing constantly over the past year or so, they will always leave Yun Qingkai with a little bit of shame. He looked pleased, but Yun Qingkai did not accept it. Li Ying had ulterior motives for all his obedience, and all the thin noodles he gave him had to be recovered. Yun Qingkai didn't want to get involved with him for unrelated people, and didn't want to take care of his family affairs anymore. Ian got this on his own, don't you want to keep it by yourself? But, Yun Qingkai personally covered the pair of jade birds and pushed them back into Li Yan's arms, with a gentle and solemn expression, this is your trophy, and everyone who loves you will be proud of you. Li Yan's black and white eyes were wide open, and his breathing was slightly quickened. The young man's blood surged and said, then, that emperor brother. Yun Qingkai earnestly said, Ian is a capable person and has the right to choose to do what he likes. Li Yan flushed. He never dreamed that Yun Qingkai would say this to him. He agrees with him, supports him, and understands him. Not only him, everyone around him also showed a strange look. It has always acted like the wind, and the hysterical cloud was reborn overnight, becoming warm and innocent, like a pearl like a jade. Chu Yang straightened his eyes. Yun Qingkai in the past was of course beautiful, but the sharpness of the beauty was revealed, and it was easy to make eyes burn, but the current Yun Qingkai restrained the arrogance, like a cat with its claws retracted, good as water, soft harmless. Go back early and don't play too late. Yun Qingkai never forgot to exhort, be careful. He passed by Chu Yang and saw the other's silly expression. Unable to hold back, he glanced sideways. How could the Chu family and the Yun family be evenly matched? Chu Taiwei and Yongxiang had been in trouble with each other for a lifetime. How could Chu Yang be so stupid that he was worthy of being the son of his father's rival? Chu Yang shrank his head in fright, and Yun Qingkai had directly boarded the carriage. He knew that Yun Qingxiao was prudent and would definitely arrange manpower to ensure that Li Yan returned to the palace safely. Yun Qingxiao was also stunned by his younger brother's horizontal eyebrows and fell back to the ground, and subconsciously asked Chu Yang, did you provoke him? Chu Yang, me, do I dare? Although Yun Qingkai is beautiful, but it can't stop him from being a big poisonous scorpion. Unless Chu Yang has a brain disease for 10 years, he will definitely not provoke Yun Qingkai. Yun Qingxiao was deeply moved, this is also true. Yun Qing resigned and went back home, ready to listen to the old father's sighing complaints, and even thought about how to comfort him. He has nothing to say with his father on weekdays, but today he can take the opportunity to express it. The carriage parked in the yard, Yun Qingkai took a deep breath, then bent over and went out. Several guards from the Forbidden City were guarded in the mansion, and his father's expression in the hall was reserved. Li Ying was sitting steadily, sipping tea. On the table between the two, there is a glaze that shouldn't be here. In this room, Chu Yang heedlessly returned to the mansion. Before entering the door, a teacup suddenly fell to pieces, and he was immediately shocked by the fright. Tai Wei Chu roared the lines that should have belonged to Yun Xiang. The old man stared at the glaze for half a month. I caused so many troubles to Yun Yu, and finally made a wedding dress for others. The old man is not angry, how am I? Can you not be angry? I don't even know who bought it. Xiangfu, Yun Qingkai followed his brother into the front hall to meet someone. Li Ying's attitude was kind, you don't need to be polite. Yun Qingkai's eyes fell on the table, suppressing the inexplicable anger, and looked at his father, this is sent from your majesty. Yun Xiang was obviously a little embarrassed. He did like it very much, but the person who sent it was Li Ying. Now it is not received, nor is it not received. So that's it. Yun Qingkai smiled, solemnly, congratulations to father for this wonderful product. Li Ying followed with a smile, seemingly meritorious and wanting to ask, Yun Qingkai spoke again, the child has not healed from his injuries and is a little tired. I want to go back and rest first. Li Ying shut up. Yun Xiang had no choice but to say, then, you go to rest first. Yun Qing resigned and walked out of the front hall without looking back. Good Li Ying, bad things for him. Suddenly a plain clothes swept to his waist. Yun Qingkai glanced at him, and the eyes of the two were touching. Yun Qingkai continued to move forward, and pulled the wooden sign off his waist. He walked all the way back to the small courtyard, and soon a voice came from beside him, the Queen. This is the eyeliner. He stayed beside Li Ying, calling Yuan Bao. Originally, I had to wait for the young secretary to find him and then ask questions, but Li Ying didn't expect Li Ying to bring people over to him directly, thinking that he had only seen the wooden sign on his waist just now, and felt that the matter was urgent, so he hurriedly followed. Yun Qingkai did not hesitate. Has there been an abnormality in the palace recently? Not in the palace, but your majesty. Before the words fell, the sound of footsteps suddenly came, and a man wearing a mysterious robe embroidered with a golden thread and dragon appeared at the corner of the corridor. Ingots slammed silently. The author has something to say, Cize, one after another. Bad my good deeds, I'm so angry. Li Huang, I didn't mean it.